The problems with the combat and the world pacing run so deep that I don't think the game can ever truly exceed just being okay to good at best, but I think they can conceivably make it better than it is now. Here's to hoping.
They messed it up. The more I play, the more I realize they messed it up. This probably is the worst game in the series. No, the worst game I've ever played in my life. I can't believe I—
Whoa, hold on. Don't you think you should give this game a fair chance?
Are you my conscience? Jiminy, is that you?
No, what? Of course not. Do I sound like Jiminy Cricket to you?
Who are you then?
It's me, Raconius.
From YouTube? So, Raconius is my conscience?
No, dude. I'm using a kind of, Kingdom Hearts telepathy to contact you through your heart. I guess you could say we're having a heart-to-heart. Well, I thought it was funny.
So is that why there's a cheap echo on your voice then?
You know what? You're no fun. Just be fair to this game and the DLC, alright? I'm not about to spend the next couple of weeks avoiding spoilers until ReMind comes to Xbox, only to realize you mistreated it like a coward while I was away. I don't care what you say as long as you're fair about it. So just do what I tell you. Otherwise, I'm gonna smack you upside the head. Got it?
Yeah, fine. Got it. I don't know why I've got to listen to you. You're not my conscience. I think I've got to figure out how to change the phone number on my heart, or figure out how to block his calls or something. Okay, so by the time you're seeing this video, Kingdom Hearts 3 will be just a bit over a year old. I've played through it 4 times up to this point. Once on Standard and once on Proud for my original critique last year, and then once on Critical Mode a few months after that released, and once more on Critical for this video. And now I've played through ReMind, though I won't spoil anything from it that wasn't already in the trailers until we actually get to discussing ReMind specifically. If you want to know my extended thoughts about the game as a whole, which will be referenced regularly in this video, I'd suggest going back to watch that original critique if you haven't yet. While things have changed with the game, many of the points made remain true, and are the building blocks for things discussed here, including updates in the DLC. Not to mention there are plenty of things I don't mention again here that are in that original video, that still apply. As the opening to this video illustrated, I thought the game was only okay when it launched. I didn't think it was awful, and I argued it was the best Osaka Team title in the series up to that point. But I also felt like they should have done a lot better considering they were no longer constrained by handheld hardware, gimmicky or limited input methods, and had access to a budget greater than they'd ever seen previously in this series. I'd have been totally fine if the game was even just as good as the better games in the series. It didn't have to revolutionize anything. But instead it floated somewhere below those games and above all of the handheld titles. One thing I neglected to take a full look at in my original video was the story. At the time there was so much to talk about related to the nuances of the gameplay, as that was far and away the most important thing to me personally, that I only talked about the story points that really stood out to me. Now though, since I once again watched all the cutscenes on this latest playthrough, and have let the writing sink in for a year, I think it's time we talk about the narrative in greater detail. Kingdom Hearts 3's story is pretty weak in a multitude of ways. I cannot stress enough just how repetitive and meandering it often is. It was honestly agonizing to sit through most of the cutscenes again, because I was shocked at just how little there was which provided engagement. The most glaringly obvious issue if you step back and analyze a bit, and a problem that bored me to tears this time around, is just how often scenes consist of nothing but characters standing around, regurgitating meaningless exposition, recounting past events to each other, or filling time with generic lines of dialogue. Even most of the action scenes are incredibly basic, which is probably the biggest disappointment about the story for me. You have to wonder why so much of the scene direction is so incredibly dull, considering they effectively had the ability to do whatever they wished here, and that this is the culmination of an 8-game saga if you don't include things like 0.2 or the media that we now know is setting up future sagas, like Back Cover, Unchained Cross, or Union Cross. 8 games is a lot of build-up for scenes that look like this to be the payoff. Compare that to the direction of the opening, which scene by scene is just genuinely incredible, even without the fantastic transitions between each scene. This cutscene bundles all of the emotion I wanted to feel across the series into a 2-minute opening, largely thanks to the scene direction. Honestly, there's a strong argument to be made that the gameplay itself is more bombastic and visually well-directed than most of the actual scenes in the game. And I, for the life of me, don't understand why, when these characters have such fantastical, super-heroic powers. This issue compounds on the core problems that so many others have illustrated repeatedly up to this point. As with many other people, I don't think putting exposition dump cutscenes in between worlds is good enough to call this a well-paced plot. The worlds needed to be integrated into the story, not because Kingdom Hearts 1 did it and we all like Kingdom Hearts 1, but because without that, literally nothing of value happens until the end of the game. A lot of people argue that KH3 had the same problem, with worlds not tying back into the main story. But first of all, at least one of your 2 visits to each mandatory world does indeed tie back to the main narrative. More importantly though, they at least still gave us goals that pertain to the story along the way. Remember, in Kingdom Hearts 2, we're still being tasked with sealing keyholes, just like KH1. This means we still have a job to do in each world. Close these worlds off from the bad guys. KH3, by contrast, literally admits repeatedly that the characters don't know why they're going to each world, or even where they're going most of the time. They're openly aimless, and don't seal any of the worlds along the way either. The only motivational conceit is that they're going where Sora's heart says to go, so that they can find the power of waking. But obviously, Sora doesn't find the power of waking or get any closer to doing so in any of the worlds. This means fundamentally, yes, these visits are less important to the story than in KH2. Even beyond that, again, this is the finale of an 8-game saga. I would argue simply sealing keyholes in each world still wouldn't quite have been enough for something so grand, wouldn't you? Sure, org members are in these worlds too, which is why Sora's heart takes them to each world. But hilariously, the things the org members are doing genuinely don't have any bearing on the story either, because nothing meaningful comes from their exploits. It's all vague research or just-in-case preparations that story-wise mean nothing. In real life, sure, having backup strategies can be important to executing on your plans. It's not like it doesn't make sense for them to have new Princesses of Heart on backup, for example, in case the heroes can't get 7 Guardians of Light together. But because we do get the necessary Guardians together, that by proxy means these org preparations were technically meaningless to the plot. They're literally doomsday preppers in a story where the doomsday they were readying for never comes. That's the big difference between this and real life. This story isn't real life, where being prepared for potential issues in your plans is a smart choice. It's a story where writers were free to write scenes, motivations, and plots in any way they wished. So if these preparations by the org don't lead to anything, why are we shown any of it? The writers chose to include scenes that meant literally nothing, when they could have instead made these scenes about anything else that was actually relevant. If the main villain in a movie spends 50% of his scenes amassing a giant army, but never chooses to use it, and it never affects our main characters in any way, why would we ever need to know about it? Why not instead fill that time with something that does affect the plot? You can see just how committed the game is to meandering in scenes like the one where Sully takes care of Vanitas. Sure, it's still a funny joke a year later, but in the context of the wider game, it's much more frustrating for me than funny. It's emblematic of the larger pacing issues with the narrative. When we're finally about to get some progress that's actually story-related, Sully puts a stop to it until we finish 3 more worlds. In HiveMind's original KH3 video, he mentions that many of these scenes just kind of feel like Sora and company are inserted into the story to occasionally be in the background during Disney movie plots. And that really is pretty much a legit summary of Sora's involvement a lot of the time. Oftentimes, if you haven't seen the movie the worlds are based on, the events don't make any sense, and Sora doesn't really do anything to affect most of the events. Events happen in spite of him. It actually reminds me of my first fanfiction attempt I started writing way back when I was a dumb punk kid. The idea was that I wanted to add a handful of characters to the existing plot of Azumanga Daioh. Not a bad writing exercise, but after a few chapters I realized that the problem with that idea was that every important plot point was set in stone already. I couldn't have these new characters act, I could only have them react. It started to feel like one of those really terrible JRPG scripts where every time anyone says anything, the entire party has to chime in, even if they have literally nothing to add, because otherwise, what use are those characters in those scenes? The issue is similar here, where Sora is just sort of there, reacting to stuff, or interacting with characters in ways that have nothing to do with the conflict in that world. He can't disturb the preset storytelling after all. Papa Disney wouldn't like that. But that also kind of means Sora, and by extension you as the player, are just sort of looking through the glass like it's a zoo or something, which doesn't feel right when you're playing as that character. I don't care if it's Disney's fault, it still ended up in the end product. There's another point in HiveMind's video when he's talking about gameplay and the lack of agency players have. I'd honestly argue that also applies to most of the story. It doesn't feel like your actions as Sora impact anything. Instead, it feels not only like the ending to most worlds are preordained, but so is every event in between. And contrary to fan defenses of KH3's story, this is most certainly completely different to how things worked in most previous games. None of it really ties back to the core plot in interesting ways. Tron's world in KH2 wasn't just a random planetoid behind a gummy mission gate. It was inside Ansem's computer in Hollow Bastion, and you had to genuinely help Tron with his problems in order to access information you needed back in Hollow Bastion. Not to mention to stop Sark and the MCP from taking over Hollow Bastion. The MCP and Sark wanted to defeat Sora just as much as Tron, rather than treating him like he was some sort of bodyguard they needed to swat away to get to Tron. As such, every character had legitimate motivations leading them to conflict. I mean, think about this. We've got some Disney characters and Final Fantasy characters in a Kingdom Hearts world interacting with Kingdom Hearts characters and Disney characters from a completely other Disney-related world. And the choices each of them makes impacts the others. Enemies like Oogie Boogie in the first game tried to get direct control over the Heartless to try and stop Sora. It all felt intertwined, like an alternative universe self-insert fanfiction. It still mostly told the same stories as the media it was based on, but things happened differently because Sora was there. Even if the ending is technically the same, Sora had an impact on the journey. That also has a big impact on how the story feels to play through, and that's why San Francisco was probably the best Disney World in terms of story, because it felt like Sora became a genuine part of the team, and therefore, the team got just as invested in helping him as he was in helping them. It felt like Sora could learn something from them and their companionship, and they learned something from him, instead of Sora just being, again, a lame-ass guardian that stopped Heartless from interrupting the play Hero and his friends were putting on. And as everyone, myself included in my original video, continues to point out, a pretty decent solution is just to spread major events throughout the rest of the game. Like I said in that original video, I still think a nice option would have been to simply give each world 2 visits again, like in Kingdom Hearts 2. The worlds here are big enough to support that this time around, and certainly more than long enough in terms of playtime. In fact, I felt and still feel many of them were too long for a single visit, so split them up and mix main plot stuff in with the Disney plot stuff along the way. Problems with KH3's plot don't stop at the macro level either. There are many micro problems that plague the storytelling here as well, so let's go through a few. One of the most common minor issues is lines that just completely fail to land. Usually these lines end up being redundant or meaningless in terms of their expository use, and when taken in terms of communication between characters, are just meant to fill space rather than make any logical sense. Similar to what we just talked about above, dialogue is supposed to exist primarily because it has some use to the story. When the dialogue doesn't add anything, or worse, contradicts established ideas, it really damages the narrative as a whole by bogging it down, or even confusing viewers. Though not the worst of them by any means, my favorite example is this line here.
You're Zigbar!
What exactly is the reason Sora would say this? He knows it's Zigbar, as do Goofy and Donald. He knows Zigbar is bad news, and the line doesn't reveal anything to us about the situation. He literally just shouts Zigbar's name for no discernible reason. The obvious intent was for it to be an exclamation of distrust, while telling players who haven't played all of the previous games the name of the character and letting us know he's bad news. But you know, he's a scarred-looking angry dude in a black cloak that comes out of a portal of darkness. Could Sora not have just said something like, Zigbar, with an angry face before putting on a smirk and saying, come to get your butt kicked again? That, too, tells us the name of the character, acknowledges that he's a bad guy that our heroes already know, and doesn't feel so clinically written. Not to be mean, but the line genuinely does remind me of interactive children's television whenever I hear it. Stuff like Dora the Explorer. Who is that? Who is it? Oh yeah, you're Zigbar! Similar issues can be found in various forms all over the place. Take this example.
My guess is no one's ever loved you before.
On the surface, that line might sound perfectly fine, but does it really make any sense? So you're telling me Ericus didn't love Xehanort despite all we know about their relationship? Sure, Woody doesn't know about their relationship, but again, his lines also have to serve the narrative being delivered to the player, who does know about said relationship. So why include a line we know isn't accurate if Xehanort isn't gonna dispute it, or reflect on it, or do anything to prove that Woody is wrong? He just takes it as if it's true and then moves on. Could Woody's line not have instead claimed that he guesses Xehanort himself has never loved anyone else, and that's his problem? We know Ericus loved Xehanort, but at this point we can't be sure Xehanort felt the same way about his best friend. Maybe it was an act. As it is, this line serves no purpose but to fill time with generic dialogue that feels ripped straight out of the Idiot's Guide to Banter Between Enemies. The line exists because the chapter on writing villains says that bad guys can't know love, and so the guidebook says that's the default line you should use, I guess. Next.
Did you see that snowman?
Snowman?
Yeah, and here's the funny thing. He was walking and talking.
Huh?
Everybody knows Snowman can't walk. You must have imagined it.
According to this joke, Donald and Goofy think snowmen can't walk or talk. Sora must have imagined it. Despite visiting worlds where monsters are real, Goofy and Donald themselves are a walking and talking dog and duck. Replicas can become human, there are walking and talking toys in one world, etc. I could maybe see this being a joke about the incredulity of such statements after all the things they've been through. But the follow-up in the next scene admits that they're serious. What is the point? Why is that even surprising to Sora after all he's seen anyway? Could they not have literally made any other joke here? There's another example near the end after Sora rescues everyone and they go back in time, right before they meet Terranord in the Keyblade Graveyard. As this bit illustrates, Donald, Goofy, and Sora clearly understand they all died, and none of the others act surprised by their strange dialogue either, giving the impression they all know they went back in time as well. Heck, Kairi definitely knows because she helps Sora make his way back. So then why does much of the same scene play out again afterward? They would already know that's not really Terra. You also have to ask why Sora reviving everyone and bringing them back in time allows Naminé to call Lingering Will back when he didn't appear before. These contradict each other, but I'm sure that'll be answered in ReMind, right? Not that this would be a solid point if it did make sense, because it still more or less amounts to a detour right at the start of the climax that does nothing but waste time so that they can slot in a DLC later. I will get to you soon, ReMind. There are bigger questions beyond that that relate to the overall inconsistencies in the arc of the series thus far. For example, why is everyone around Old Man Xehanort, including Ansem, Xemnas, Terranort, and young Xehanort, so decidedly bent on doing evil things? And yet Xehanort himself is supposed to be a misunderstood guy who just made mistakes because he wanted the world to be in balance. Why would he be okay with the horrible things his organization does and their calls for absolute darkness, if he really just wants to reset the world to its original form with a balance between light and darkness? Evil be evil, I guess? Put down that idiot's guide, please. Try to write something for yourself. One also has to ask why the games still haven't explained what Kingdom Hearts actually is and what it's capable of. Sure, we know it's the heart of all worlds and that it grants ultimate power and wisdom or whatever, but what does that mean? Previous games have established 2 fake Kingdom Hearts, one of which everyone thought was the real thing, including Ansem. They clearly established that other parts of Xehanort, like Ansem and Xemnas, misunderstood what Kingdom Hearts really is to some extent, and therefore what its powers are. So I don't think we should suddenly just be expected to assume Old Man Xehanort knows what Kingdom Hearts is and what it can do, and yet that's exactly what they ask of the audience. The writers had a choice here. They could have just given it to us without making us question what Kingdom Hearts is, meaning whatever magical powers the writers wanted to give it can be accepted without question because magic. Or, as they ultimately chose, they could have brought into question what Kingdom Hearts is and what a real Kingdom Hearts is made of, and what it can do. But that also requires that they give us proof for why we should believe Xehanort knows enough to use it in his plan. Without committing fully to either of these directions, we're stuck in a middle ground where we have no reason to actually trust his knowledge of Kingdom Hearts, which makes his plan feel flaccid and lacking in true tension. But we're still supposed to take the threat seriously anyway, because he's the bad guy. Sure, as far as we can tell, his plan ultimately rings true, but that doesn't mean it works as motivation for our characters or the player, particularly since we still never really got an explanation for why resetting to a world of balance is such a bad thing in the first place. Because he has yellow eyes, pointy ears, a veiny bald head, and likes to wiggle his fingers? A broken clock is still right twice a day, bro. It's so strange to me that the extent of Kingdom Hearts' powers we see in KH3 is that it can shoot some dark orbs. Wow, for the namesake of the entire series, and the thing the entirety of this arc centers on, that's a pretty lame power. Ansem can do that. Such a special power, right? Also, is there a reason Sora still hasn't been told about the events of Chain of Memories in great detail yet? Like, when he sees Marluxia for the first time in KH3, why is he still so dumb that he doesn't immediately assume new org members that remember him are old ones he forgot? This type of scene shows up several times, and each time it spends a not insignificant amount of time on generic banter between whatever org member Sora doesn't remember and Sora himself. It's always like, "Who are you? You don't remember? What a pity. Why? Should I remember you? That's not important now." Cool, are you done wasting time yet? Oh, you're just gonna tease Sora with riddles for a minute and run away. Alright, later, doofus. How about the fact that Xemnas says he needs Larxene, Marluxia, Demyx, and Luxord for a special purpose related to revealing their Keyblade legacy as part of his plan, but this never happens in KH3 nor in ReMind. Again, I ask, what's the point? Sequel bait? Obviously, a lot of info about this specific topic has already been revealed in the mobile game stuff, so I won't get into it. But that doesn't change the fact that Xemnas is planning to use their Keyblade legacy in some way, and his plan goes beyond KH3. This at very least implies that he's not gone for good, which arguably means that the Darkseeker saga isn't really done for either. There's absolutely no reason not to expect more stuff with Xehanort as an important character, especially considering the mobile experience they just announced. So that fresh start many people were hoping for with the next major title, the one that we were told was happening over and over again, yeah, you can forget that. Why even have this in this game? And similar to scenes with the box, spend large amounts of time talking about it, only to forget it by the end of the game. At least do something with it. The plot issue that bothers me the most, however, takes place early in the game. It bothers me because the series refuses to be consistent with how it treats Keyblades. So, it has been repeatedly established that Keyblades are supposed to be conscious or sentient in some sense, and can make choices of their own. When a wielder dies without transferring the Keyblade to someone else, the Keyblade dies along with them. It's a strangely beautiful relationship that gives them some human-like character. So then why isn't Riku upset when his Keyblade, which is effectively a special companion who has protected him through the worst of his suffering, is snapped in half? Not to mention, how does he just get a new one? If they can just make and power up Keyblades willy-nilly, why haven't they been doing it this whole time? There are also a few other minor presentation issues I found. Remember the snowman stuff from earlier? Did you notice this part where Sora, Donald, and Goofy are just staring blankly right at Olaf and don't react until after the camera moves to them? For God's sake, turn them around and play a generic talking animation so they don't notice them yet, or something. As others have mentioned before me, the flashback scene Anna has here is also a damned mess. The fact that the song and the narration speak over each other is baffling, especially since it still hasn't been addressed through patches. Then she just starts singing to herself out loud before going back to exposition as if that's normal. I don't care whether Disney is to blame for stuff like this or not, it's still a problem. A similar issue can be found in the scene at the end of the world, where Demyx is sitting there tuning his instrument during their discussion, and yet no sound is coming out of it. Why not just have him doing nothing with his idle animation then? Because having his idle be a tuning animation where he's actively listening to see how close it is to being in tune only draws attention to the fact that it's not making noise. What is he listening for here? Back when I did my original critique, I mentioned that the game had some lip sync issues. Here's another example that I'm absolutely amazed I didn't catch on my first playthrough.
Stay here, kitty, we'll be back.
I'm not going to pretend these small presentation problems are important. They're not on their own. But I can't for the life of me understand why they wouldn't simply change some of these small problems. Again, why not just give Demyx a more basic idle animation without his instrument like they do in other scenes? Why not just drop the audio on the song a bit when Anna is talking about her past? Why not cut to one more shot of Boo at the point where Sully's lip syncing is at its worst? Are these not easy last-minute fixes that could simply be done in a patch? Overall, KH3's story is a major missed opportunity. For as emotional as people get over a lot of these scenes, I think it could be much more powerful if the direction was stronger. I can't help but to imagine how much more engaging it would be if, right after Ventus wakes up, he and Vanitas circle each other, menacing dialogue and vague threats being thrown out. Then there's a massive clash that ultimately leaves Ventus utterly decimated. The team then starts to wonder if they have any chance against the whole organization, especially when they might already be down an ally. I can't help but to imagine scenes of Kairi and Axel training, and even the ability to pick one to play as during their final training session, meaning you can effectively choose which to fight as a boss. I can't help but to imagine Kairi using these newfound skills to actually save Sora from near defeat for once. I can't help but to imagine Riku being genuinely upset that his Keyblade is actually killed. Or what about Terra becoming genuinely angry that his body was used for so much evil this whole time? There's just so much that could have been done, but they didn't do, because they were too busy dumping exposition on us about nothing in particular. Nobody could possibly be interested in these characters for the character, right? Everyone is clearly interested because they enjoy nonsense technical jargon about how fake bodies can be used as vessels, or repeated checkups on whether Sora has found the power of waking yet, or endless scenes about how he has lost his powers that literally don't matter, especially because he's gaining other new powers out of nowhere the whole time. Nah, that's what's important to people, not the characters. Whatever, it's fine in the end because there's this bit here where Goofy dabs. So all is forgiven, Kingdom Hearts 3. Jokes aside, I wasn't sure of a way to effectively summarize my thoughts on KH3's story. Then, while looking for early ReMind reviews, I found a really nice video by a channel known as Chrono Katie, which I feel summarized KH3's story rather well. I think it also really eloquently illustrates why there's a divide between people who loved the story and people who hated it.
It was a major problem I had with it. I think that the story's not very good. It's more of a game that's kind of full of great moments, not necessarily a great story.
I agree with the sentiment presented here entirely, though I personally would probably be harsher with my wording. For me, it's a story with some good moments, but isn't really good as a whole. It's pretty terrible as a whole if you ask me. I sincerely think this is a strong part of why people are so divided on the story of the game, though. It feels like it really depends on whether you're the type of person who values powerful moments in stories more, or someone who values a consistent whole more. For me, I like the concept of some of these scenes, and some of the execution. I like the bit where Terranort chains everyone up, and they break free thanks to Terra, symbolizing him breaking his own chains. Despite feeling nothing for Shion's character, I like the part where everyone remembers her and she switches sides. I like everything with Vanitas in it. I like everything with Larxene in it too. I like all of these bits in isolation. But it's more because they're well directed, or the characters involved are the ones with spicy attitudes, and less because they make the story as a whole feel deeper or more solidly written. They're great concepts for scenes that are let down by the rest of the game, and personally that's just not near enough. I can't ignore the squandered potential. So what of the gameplay on critical mode then? When I made the first video, I pointed out a host of issues that related to balance, the design of the bosses and mobs, and questionable design choices surrounding movement and combat options. My biggest issue came down to how clunky and poorly thought out combat options often were, but things have been changed around quite a bit with critical mode, and even more so when ReMind released. First though, let's go through critical mode without the additions of the DLC, because that's how I played through it both times, and that's what my footage reflects. Also, as stated in that first video, my comparisons to KH2 will be because KH2 provides the best combination of variety and balance in the series for gameplay. KH3 does not need to be Kingdom Hearts 2, but it's not wrong to expect it to have the same level of balance as Kingdom Hearts 2. Please note that if I don't mention something, it might be because there were no changes made, like team attacks for example. They're still functionally random in casual play. As such, there's nothing to say because they don't affect crit any differently than other difficulties. Same with game performance. As far as I can tell, performance is still the same as it was at launch, with frame pacing issues at 30 FPS in the consistency mode, and varying issues locking to 60 FPS in the default mode, depending on the platform you're using and what resolution the system is internally set at. To start, one thing I failed to mention for some reason in my original video was just how insanely uninteresting most of your abilities are mechanically. I did briefly mention that attractions more or less all just amounted to area of effect explosions, with only Blaster Blaze offering some real mechanical agency that took a bit of skill to use well. But I completely failed to illustrate the gravity of the situation because the vast majority of your abilities actually lead to the same generic AoE effect. Links are AoEs, most form change finishers are AoEs, shot locks, grand magic, attractions. About the only options that aren't AoE centric are combos, basic fire elemental magic, basic water elemental magic, and basic blizzard elemental magic. Beside when you're in certain form changes, fire, water, and blizzard are all basically the same homing missile attack instead.
Water gives you 2 chances to hit, with a brief shield of water that can block some attacks or tag enemies you're right next to, and Blizzard can leave a flow motion trail to skate across. But other than that, they're all identical. Thunder and Arrow are AoE as well, with Arrow working like a discount magnet that consistently puts you in flow motion when you don't want it to. KH3 greatly limits the utility of spells, and it makes Sora much less versatile than in KH2 or even KH1. In KH2, Blizzard was a fast, large projectile that fired straight ahead and could pierce enemies. Fire surrounded you to keep you safe and attacked from all sides. Magnet pulled enemies in and could allow you to go straight into finishers. Thunder was your AoE, and it could hit from basically any range. And Reflect completely protected you while dishing out insane damage when timed well. In comparison, every spell in KH3 is either the homing projectile or an AoE attack, or in the case of Grand Magic, a combination of both. Well, I said I liked the magic system in the original video. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't really true. I still like that you can move while casting, and that you can combo spells in the air. But otherwise it's uninspired thanks to the simplicity of the spell effects. And when you add in that there are no unique spells that aren't inherently damage focused, like Reflect or Magnet, the system only looks more and more basic. What's more, since they nerfed the damage of spells in one of the updates to KH3, links have more or less become the go-to way to use your MP. Sure, you can still spam spells, particularly on easier difficulties, but on critical you won't get that many casts before you're out of MP, since MP, similar to health, is cut in half, as is the growth for both stats. This is actually a sticking point for many hardcore players, who feel like magic has become largely useless on critical. Since they already made other crit-specific changes to existing balance, one solution could have been to tie the magic vitality balance choice at the beginning to which stat gets half growth. Pick balance and both HP and MP will get 2/3 normal growth. Pick vitality and your HP will grow normally, but MP growth is halved, and the opposite would be true for picking magic. As it stands, while links require a full bar of MP, in return they heal Sora by quite a bit, greatly raise his defenses for the entirety of the event, and sometimes you can even gain enough MP orbs while in a link to refill your MP completely, allowing you to literally chain links together. Get it? In most situations, this makes them much more effective than spells, because you effectively get a free cure and use of a summon that can on occasion take over 4 or 5 bars of health from bosses, or flatten entire forced mob fights. They're genuinely the most overpowered part of your arsenal on crit. Some, like Ralph, take a decent amount of thought and skill to use well. Others, like Simba, just wreck everything around you for free by simply spamming attacks. But at the same time, they're for the most part not particularly interesting to strategize around, especially because using one means you can't use any spells beforehand. It's spells or links because it takes a full MP bar. Using Simba's jump on the tentacles during the Davy Jones fight is probably the most proactively strategic use I found for a link that wasn't Ralph, but it's also clunky because Simba is so big, making the strategy unpredictable, which is a true shame. Attractions, meanwhile, are just as broken as they were before, and just as repetitive. Luckily, one of the new abilities on crit is Critical Converter, which disables attractions but guarantees that every time you get 3 arrows on the situation gauge, you're guaranteed a form change for the Keyblade you're using. I hate using this word, but that is probably the most lazy way they could have rebalanced attractions, because they genuinely just allowed players to remove them from the mode. But I can say that I absolutely do not miss them, and I like the guaranteed form changes you get in exchange much better. The overall point is that these systems are largely identical to each other outside of aesthetic differences, and none of them have much depth, nor can they often work together. As I said in the first video, your links aren't additive to your basic attack options like summons were in KH2. They place you in a minigame, a different mode of play, meaning you're either using a link and not using other forms of combat, or you're using other forms of combat and not in a link. The same is true of attractions, and the most depth you'll get from Grand Magic or most form change finishers is simply trying to make sure they hit as many targets as possible.
Form changes themselves, meanwhile, are often incredibly dangerous to use on crit. Some of them are super sluggish, to the point that you're all but guaranteed to get hit while using them, like the hammer-style ones. Others, like the dual guns, can occasionally lead to players floating toward danger, and the claws don't allow you to block, which becomes useless in many situations that require good defenses and counters. About the only ones that are genuinely useful are Second Form and Second Form S, Counter Shield, Mirage Staff, Ultimate Form, and the new forms the ReMind update added with Oblivion and Oathkeeper. On my first crit playthrough, I experimented with many other forms, and got stomped over and over before I finally settled on primarily using Hero's Origin and Counter Shield. If used correctly, Counter Shield can protect you pretty well, and dole out tons of counter damage, but its basic combo attacks aren't particularly great. On this playthrough, I spammed the heck out of Ever After and Mirage Staff, which has some insanely strong combos and can do mountains and mountains of safe, long-distance damage if you use the clones created when you dodge. On top of this, if you have elemental cufflinks on, it can grant you tons of free grand magic. Thankfully, with crit they also added New Game Plus, which allows you to carry over all Keyblades you've obtained from a previous playthrough. Their synthesis upgrades are reset, but being able to use any form change from the start of the game feels great, even if only a few of them are genuinely useful. Along with Critical Converter disabling attractions but guaranteeing form changes, Critical Mode adds several other abilities and makes a multitude of other changes. Your HP and MP are half that of Proud Mode, as I said before, as are their growth over the course of the game. The arrows for situation commands fill significantly slower on crit, but equipping the ability Critical Recharge allows them to fill at a quicker rate when you're in MP charge. And guarding the moment before an attack hits can now lead to incredibly powerful reprisal counters if you have Critical Counter equipped, denoted by Sora briefly glowing red. This is by far one of my favorite abilities in the game. Guarding, when it works, just plain feels great in KH3, and exploiting Critical Counter by just guarding to do huge damage is even more satisfying. This is especially the case in places where you can do it repeatedly during an enemy combo. Beyond these abilities, you start with a swath of other combat options you wouldn't normally get right away, and a massive bucket of extra AP to help you equip them all. These changes are wonderful, and I genuinely miss the critical specific abilities when playing on other difficulties. One other positive note is that Payback Strike is much more balanced on crit. In spite of its massive amount of invincibility frames and huge reach, you take so much damage on crit that you can't spam it repeatedly anymore. Rising Spiral is more useful here as well, because now that enemies can actually pose a real threat, and you don't consistently have attractions to bail you out, it can be preferable to keep certain enemies like large bodies up off the ground and away from the rest of the mob. That being said, it can still get in the way, as my original video stated, because as long as you have it equipped, Sora will always default to using it rather than Double Flight if you're in a combo. This can lead to bosses, particularly in ReMind, escaping you thanks to how slow Rising Spiral is. It's also worth noting that you can't use Rising Spiral in form changes, meaning you don't have an easy way to isolate enemies in many other forms. When crit released, the rest of your combo abilities were more or less identical to what they were on launch day. They'd seemingly made some minor adjustments here and there, but moves like Speed Slash were still completely unsafe to use, and none of your finishers could cancel into a block. Movement abilities also didn't cancel well at all, and were lacking all of the nuance, variety, and speed they had in KH2. Combos and movement with base Sora were therefore pretty limited and tame, which not only felt repetitive, but also once again further limited your versatility. Sometimes you could even have issues with abilities not responding to inputs, like in this example against the Heartless Tornado boss, where I tried to use Double Flight to get high enough to start using my healing Shotlock, only for the input to get eaten, causing me to fall to the ground and die. Some abilities, like the finisher for Counter Shield, are needlessly dangerous too because they take player control away, as seen in this example. It's also well known that in some places, Guard fails to actually stop attacks properly, as seen here. All of this means the most tactical and strategic ability in your entire arsenal was probably the Shotlock Air Step in the original game, which kept movement speeds high and created a rhythm between combos and enemies.
It was also, for me, the most kinetically satisfying move to pull off well, at least before the free ReMind update, which we'll get to when we get to it. Slow down, cowboy. We've got just a few more topics to touch on for crit. Whoa. Wait, did you just see... Did Sora just do a skateboard Keyblade attack? Did you know about this? Was this here the whole time? Goofy's dabbing in shit and now Sora can do skateboard Keyblade attacks? Game's nuts. 10 out of 10. Anyway, there are apparently AI changes for enemies on Crit, but I couldn't tell you exactly what they are, and I couldn't find resources with definitive answers either. Since enemies do the same damage they did on Proud, but you have half health, some players might feel it necessary to rely on food more than they did before, which was not at all. Fortunately, for those of us who like low-level runs, KH3's less than stellar damage floor system isn't quite as bad as most people originally thought. Using any form change will offer you an ability that allows you to do decent damage regardless of your level. This means with basic Sora, you're still going to do pretty awful damage at lower levels, especially considering how many health bars most bosses have, but once you activate a form, things feel a lot more like KH2 does during low level or level 1 runs. It's not as good as just straight damage scaling based on the world level, but it's still better than nothing. If you expected improvements to the camera, prepare for disappointment, because as far as I know, not a single thing has been altered in that department. It still can't be pulled back near as far as it can in KH2 in most circumstances, and yet at random times it loves to zoom way too far out, lose track of Sora, push way too far in, or let objects get in your way. This is particularly brutal on Crit because a single mistake can often mean death. Despite the upgrade in difficulty, some bosses are still a bit too easy to learn, while others rely on pest enemies or distractions to raise their difficulty, sometimes to absurdity. The doll boss in Toy Box has a bunch of enemies constantly chasing you, for example, and the Monstropolis boss has insane defense outside of the one short phase where he constantly shoots you away when you get close. It's worth noting that I intentionally didn't look up Crit speedrun strats until after this run, because I wanted to play it like a normal player would. As such, bosses like the Monstropolis one were massive time sinks that didn't really provide a challenge so much as just raised the chance of a mistake leading to a death purely because of how long the battle can last. Vanitas and Terranort together can super armor just enough attacks to become an annoying pain that feels inconsistent, especially when your allies are dead. On other difficulties, your allies can hold their own. On Crit, the classic problem of them dying almost instantly crops up occasionally. And particularly in instances with several powerful enemies, that can spell trouble for Sora. According to Biscuit047's video on the game, generally you'll only be targeted by one powerful enemy at a time when allies are alive, but that still means that when they're dead, you can easily get ganged up on. The doll boss, meanwhile, showcases a lot of the core issues with the game, and particularly with Crit. The worst issue is that enemies on Crit adore coming at you from off-screen, and wasting you before you can even react. If you don't believe me, here's a montage of a bunch of examples on my initial Crit playthrough, after which we'll go over a few specific examples from the most recent playthrough.
Stop a true hero! Take this!
It can't... No, it can't be... No, it can't be... I can't give up. I can't give up.
Especially early on, this is a painful occurrence, but that doesn't mean it won't happen later in the game either. Here's an example from Monstropolis where a large body comes from off-screen behind me and one-shots me. These enemies in Port Royal love to abuse you from off-screen too. The first real fight in the world is pretty garbage, honestly, because the enemies do so much damage, can pretty easily survive using Simba unless your magic stat is rather high, and they can attack swiftly from a huge range while off-screen. Here's an example from San Francisco during the part where you're supposed to rescue the rest of the team. While trying to rescue Honey Lemon, I get shot in the back and die immediately. How you're supposed to react to something like that without a barrier block, I have no idea. Even enemies in minigames can have this problem, like the Arendelle Dragon Avalanche minigame. This time around it only took me 2 tries on crit, but that was partially luck, and partially because I died like 40 times on my first playthrough on crit, so I got a general idea for how to play it safe. I was super close to rage quitting my first time, because they love to shoot their lasers from off-screen and the sluggish controls can make jumps difficult to time. There's no healing either, so 3 mistakes and you're dead. It's ridiculous to me that they could make it so that Gummy doesn't become super impossible on crit, but they can't nerf the laser damage for these 3 enemies in this one minigame. The only enemy I used Ultima Weapon on in either playthrough was the Wolf Boss, because the 2 mandatory Desperation move cutscenes you have to watch are just unacceptable. Beyond that, his inconsistent attack hitboxes, ability to turn on a dime, and the fact that he's too big to keep squarely in frame caused a lot of headaches on my first playthrough. He's not what I would call a good fight on crit, and I wasn't about to suffer through it again, or grind enough levels to destroy him. Like, I know that I was mostly underleveled and didn't really use food during either playthrough. That's not the game's fault entirely. At least the food part isn't. I didn't rush through either playthrough, so I don't think I should be so severely underleveled, but most of my problems wouldn't be solved by leveling more or using food anyway. The problem isn't that most attacks that hit me from off-screen were a one-shot. The problem is that I was frequently getting hit from off-screen in the first place. Why couldn't they have just made it so that enemies don't attack you when they're not on screen? Devil May Cry 5 does that. Instead, in that game, their AI does everything it can do to get on screen, which then gives them permission to attack. That would also make the lack of a barrier block for base Sora feel less painful, because generally if an enemy is on screen, you're probably facing them, meaning a well-timed block will stop them. Another alternative would have been to build a token system for the AI similar to Doom 2016, where there's a limited amount of tokens that each enemy can use to take actions at any given time. They have to ask the AI director for permission to have a token, and if it's granted, they can spend it on a single action. But other, more powerful, and therefore more important enemies can steal tokens, providing just a bit more unpredictability and emphasis on interacting with the most dangerous enemies first. This also means you generally get hit a lot less from the back because the stronger enemies are stealing the tokens from the weaker ones. The point is, there are a multitude of solutions to the enemies hitting you from off-screen, but none of them are used. Some people argue the same thing happens in KH2, and while it technically can occur, it's not near as common, because battles generally have less enemies spawned in at once, the camera is pulled out far enough to see more enemies, movement abilities are swifter, more agile, safer, and things like aerial dodge can even give you invincibility frames. There are less enemies using projectiles, and enemies are generally a bit slower to react overall. They fit the design of Sora's moveset much more snugly, meaning genuinely getting hit from off-screen in a way that you couldn't react to is usually much less common in KH2, and it can be dealt with easier thanks to things like aerial dodge, quick run, the more consistent hitbox for guard, and the reflect spell. Anyway, there's technically one reason why I was underleveled in both my critical playthroughs, which is a monster that only rears its ugly head when all of the previous issues come together. You know how people greatly praised KH3's worlds for being vast, open, and having very few loading screens? It's deserved praise. However, when designing these areas, they skipped over one major conceit such world design needs to have, which makes normal exploration extremely risky on crit. Checkpoints in KH3 suck, and on crit, they're deadly. Sure, I too like how big the areas are, but it's insane to me that they didn't realize how much more brutal that makes dying, since checkpoints at times can be extremely sparse. They generally only checkpoint you when a story event occurs, or when you enter a new area, which some worlds legit only have 2, maybe 3 areas tops. You'd think mob fights that start with cutscenes, like the water enemies during the climb up Mount Olympus, would always checkpoint you. But they don't. In fact, until you get to Rock Titan, there isn't a single checkpoint or save point in this area, so if you die, you can lose upwards of 30 minutes of exploration, leveling, menuing, everything. Sure, level cells in previous games were small, but at least previous games checkpointed you more frequently. On both crit playthroughs of KH3, the horrible checkpoints effectively gave me 2 options: use overpowered equipment and abilities like Ultima Weapon so I'm not risking failure, or skip fights, which is what I ended up doing both times. This meant even when exploring and taking things as slow as I could, I still ended up really underleveled. They added checkpoints before you start minigames and such in a lot of instances, which was an issue in games like Kingdom Hearts 2, where if you went into the data battle room, started a data battle, and then died, it would reset all of the menuing you may have done in there. That's fixed in Kingdom Hearts 3, so I don't know why the rest of the checkpoint system is half-baked. If there was some persistence to death, like Dark Souls, it'd be fine, but resetting my menuing changes, levels, items, and money found, and then throwing me back to the start of a massive area isn't engaging. It's bullshit. Here's a perfect example of how bad it can be.
Come on, let's head over to the...
Let's see.
This. Nice.
Town.
Let's see. I can't give up.
Let's head over to the toy store.
If you still don't think it's bullshit though, you will when I let you know that it sometimes deletes any pictures you've taken since the last checkpoint, lucky emblem photos or not. What other game is so dumb that it doesn't instantly save personal creations like that if you die? That'd be like if you spent time creating a livery for a car in a racing game, and then it was deleted when you lost your first race and clicked retry because it only saves stuff after you win a race. It makes no sense, and at this point, that's the fix I want the most out of any if they continue to patch the game, purely because I think it's something they could fix fairly easily, so they might actually be willing to do it, but it would also have an enormous impact on the casual playability of Crit. I don't want it to sound like I think critical mode is bad in KH3, because it's not. Your options are much more valuable here than they are on other difficulties. Gameplay asks infinitely more of the player, and there are ways to mitigate many of the issues. That said, it's not fantastic either. Unless you're willing to risk losing mountains of progress, fighting optional mobs is far too risky. But if you skip them, you'll be underleveled and struggle to have enough money to buy food or items that can compensate for getting hit in the back all the time. Most of your options are still just generic AoE soup, and I still believe many things like movement options are more dangerous than beneficial in many contexts. That's not to say you can't learn to deal with these things, or find workarounds for the difficulty mode's issues, but I don't feel many of these issues should be here after so many years after KH2, so many years of KH3's development, and so many updates. But is Crit still worth it? Yeah, I'd say it's worth it. Does it transform KH3 into something much greater? No, not really. But then what about ReMind? A year's wait and $30 more later, what does it provide to the experience?
Okay, so now that we're all caught up to the present, it's time to discuss ReMind. Spoilers are fair game from this point forward. Quick note, my copy of ReMind was provided by a fan who wishes to remain anonymous, in the interest of me doing this video. Before release, I didn't have the money to justify buying a $30 DLC, let alone with so many other more important games on the horizon, many of which have now been pushed back. To be clear though, I wasn't by any means under the impression that we were getting anything close to what I could justify such a steep price for anyway. As I've said before, value is subjective. Also, amount of content generally isn't really what I would call a great metric to use to judge the value of a game on a personal level, when you could instead judge by the amount of content that you will find valuable. After all, it doesn't matter if a DLC is 100 hours of content on average, if 99% of it is cutscenes and you're somebody who really wants as much gameplay per dollar as they can get, but it could be the reverse for someone else. So for me, the issues with ReMind's price came partially down to my expectations for KH3, how they were not met, and likewise, how little ReMind seemed to be addressing those issues. I don't care how much story they packed into ReMind. I wanted gameplay balancing, improvements to the combat variety and depth, and a large amount of new fights to explore the combat changes with. The marketing primarily showed us things that didn't gel well with that at all. Sure, they said we were getting over 13 new boss fights, but every piece of footage they showed was a remixed version of existing bosses. What's more, these were bosses that were already recycled from several previous titles. They were effectively remixes of remixes of remixes of remixes. Sure, what ultimately matters is how they worked mechanically, but it's not like aesthetics aren't important and don't inform gameplay. Another fight with Larxene is still more than likely going to have a lot of the same attack pattern styles, mechanical traits, and combat pacing. Even if the actual fight plays out differently, similar to something like Green Hill Zone in Sonic Mania, it can still fail to engage on a personal level. Beyond this, they continued to talk about how many new cutscenes and revelations they were including, but only showed a few seconds of a new area to explore leading up to release. Almost everything it showed was, again, repeat boss fights, which left me extremely terrified it would mean we were effectively just getting a hard mode version of the Keyblade Graveyard segment of the original game. Oh, but this time you could choose other characters to play as, right? Sure, I wanted to play as Kairi even before KH3 came out, and I thought it might be novel to play as her when she was shown off in the ReMind trailers, but it also didn't excite me because, remember, the main thing I wanted in this DLC was a focus on refining and deepening the combat. Creating new characters to play as isn't that. If anything, that guarantees that a lot of development time is going to be spent on building out shallow movesets for these alternative characters, and therefore neglecting Sora. I wasn't for a second under the impression that these characters would have any more depth than Riku or Aqua did in the base game. As such, I didn't really see how this DLC would be worth even close to $30 for me. I couldn't trust that the Pro and Easy mode menus would provide value to an already shaky base game, and while novel, I'm not interested in paying for a fancy photo mode. So from my perspective, they were effectively charging for a lot of things people justifiably expected to have been in the main game, or at least in updates shortly afterward. I don't think the final mix argument holds up in 2020 either. The devs knew what people wanted going into base KH3, and yet they delivered less than what we could have even expected from a non-final mix version of some of the previous games. Some people make the argument that there wasn't that much post-game content in the original Japanese version of KH1, or the original version of Kingdom Hearts 2 as a defense. The idea is that they were equally lacking, so it's fine that KH3's optional combat-oriented offerings were anemic, but these are pallid attempts to scrape together a defense. The very original version of KH1 was an experiment they couldn't be sure would succeed. They invested the necessary time and energy that minimized risk, and that's it. When it did extremely well, they added more content for future versions, and yet both the original Japanese version of KH1 and the original version of KH2 had more post-game combat content than KH3 did anyway. Isolated super bosses aren't the only combat-oriented optional content in these games. Did we forget about the Colosseum battles? If we combine all of the battle gates from KH3 together, we'd get maybe 1 or 2 Colosseum Cups worth of fights, and don't forget, these Colosseum fights not only gave us interesting mob configurations each round, and often unique rewards from winning each cup, but they had their own unique bosses, along with supercharged versions of story bosses, like Cloud, Leon, Yuffie, Rock Titan, Tifa, Hades, etc. There's absolutely no comparison. KH3 was objectively lacking in this department. But let's also not forget that, up to this point, final mix versions of previous games were largely a necessity. As I said in my original critique, while I do think there's a limit to how much a consumer should expect to be packed into a new game, regardless of how much content might have been in the games that preceded it, final mix as a concept was something that originally came about because there was no digital distribution platform on the PS2 for DLC, nor any way to distribute patches to existing owners of the game, so they had to re-release the entire game again, which meant charging for the game again. As they went on, they continued to do it this way, getting a pass mostly because the re-releases were still only in a single region or were on a different platform, where you obviously can't simply release DLC by itself if the game doesn't yet exist on that platform. Today, we live in a world where these things can be added not only through DLC, but through patches. What this effectively translates to is the expectation that early KH3 adopters spend $90 to get a complete experience. Whether you can justify that for yourself or not, it's not a particularly fair expectation when so much was missing from the base game. While my mind was still completely open to being proven wrong, that was the perspective I was coming into this DLC with. I wasn't looking for a bad time, but I wasn't going to just lay down and accept whatever was given to me either, when the base game already struggled on so many fronts. Unlike a lot of people, I do not believe Nomura is God. So then let's start breaking down ReMind's actual content and the quality of it all. We might as well get some of the tertiary experiences out of the way first, because they're by far the least important thing to me. ReMind comes with a slideshow maker that allows you to put pictures in a certain order, pick a song from a list, and it will generate a slideshow that you can save and share. I genuinely don't care for this whatsoever, but I doubt it took up much development time, so no harm done. And I'm sure it goes well with the picture scene creator, which is pretty cool despite not really being my thing either. As you can see here, I decided to replicate the tribal dance that's required to appease the sea salt ice cream gods. This is a decently powerful feature, though they strangely limit which characters and props can be used in which environments for some reason. Otherwise though, you have a lot of options and it's perfect for making video thumbnails, so I expect all the Kingdom Hearts YouTubers to use it constantly, or we'll riot. Right guys? Anyway. Moving on, the core DLC is split into 3 chapters. ReMind is the story bit, Limit Cut consists of the super boss data fights, and Secret Episode is a fight with Yozora from the Verum Rex bit in the base game. Initially, this seems fine, but it quickly provides us with a major problem that still baffles me, and created a wealth of frustration. I can't for the life of me think of any justification for the way this was handled. Kingdom Hearts 3 still only gives players 9 save slots, but if you want to repeat a DLC later on without going through the entire game again, you have to save the DLC to a different save slot. For me, this quickly got insanely confusing. Remembering which files are which can be difficult unless you literally only played the game once on one slot before the DLC released, and only plan on playing the DLC once. I had all of my slots filled with files of varying importance, and had to decide which files weren't worth keeping. This means my DLC files are scattered across the list, which gets difficult to keep track of, but the problem is much worse than it sounds on the surface, because it's not even just an issue for someone like me, who had files prepared for capturing footage of the Pro and Easy Premium menus, which is a feature we'll discuss later. Think about most hardcore KH fans for a second. Over 2019, they probably played the game on standard at release, because they weren't sure if Proud would be too hard or not on their first playthrough, or if beating the game unlocked critical mode, which would make playing through Proud first redundant. They probably did most everything on the standard file. However, after standard was way too easy, they went through the game again on Proud, since crit indeed didn't exist yet. This time, they might have saved some extra files, because after finishing standard, they realized they couldn't refight any of the bosses from the end of the game, because there was no Coliseum or data stuff. So let's say that's 3 more files in total. The base Proud file, 1 before Anti-Aqua and Vanitas, and then 1 after the Heartless Tornado fight. After Crit came out, they probably played through it on that difficulty too, because Proud had still been too easy. Not to mention, Crit had the new abilities and tweaks unique to it, which sounded interesting to them. Also, everyone else who was playing it said it was really good, so why not give it a try? Just for consistency's sake, so we can assume they're a pragmatic, forward-thinking person, let's say they replaced the Proud files entirely here with Crit versions. That means we're still at about 4 out of 9 files. Then ReMind comes out and says, hey, if you want to play the DLC again, each DLC chapter has to take up a separate slot from your normal file. So immediately, that's 3 more files, bringing the total up to 7. But what they didn't tell you, and the thing that made some of my preparation files useless, is that in order to use the easy mode or pro mode menus, you have to start from a new file. And as far as I can tell, you can't do both menus at once in the base game, outside of one specific circumstance which we'll get to later. So that's 2 more files minimum, even if you only want to play through easy mode and pro mode once. That's all 9 slots taken up. You could probably delete your extra crit files, since ReMind effectively offers the same experience, bringing you down to 7 slots again. But unless you want to 100% the game again, your standard file is probably too important to delete, and a crit mode file for most of the people really into KH3's gameplay is basically mandatory too. Want to do ReMind, Limit Cut, and Secret Episode on a different difficulty after that? Well, you're short 1 slot. Delete something. Want to do a level 1 run? Delete something. Want to try crit again with all of the new abilities ReMind adds? Delete something. Want to get both Oathkeeper and Oblivion, but you don't want to find every lucky emblem again, meaning you have to do New Game Plus on crit to get Oblivion on a file you already got Oathkeeper on? Delete something. Want to experiment with the premium menus on different difficulties? Delete something, delete something, delete something. Please recognize the fact that we're not making redundant files here. It's not like I'm talking about someone like myself, who has like 3 different crit playthroughs saved separately on KH2 that are all basically identical but I don't want to delete. All these files here have an individual purpose. Yes, you can back these saves up elsewhere and free up slots that way, but that's not a very respectful solution to your consumer. Originally, I didn't have too much of a problem with this. More than likely, the reason for the limited slots is because each slot has to save hundreds of unique pictures for the player, so it's an understandable compromise. But then why force players to make so many extra files to use your DLC content in any effective manner? Could they not have just made it all one file that saved over your base game file and then offered a menu option in save points or something that allowed you to restart DLC chapters? Or what if every main file had like 5 sub-slots of files that you could save extra backups in, which used the same 200 or whatever photo slots, so that you have 9 files where you can have 200 photos, and then with each of those you can save extra files that don't add extra photo slots. I'm not going to pretend that I know the logistical difficulties of making it work this way, but the alternative they chose is kind of unacceptable. You don't ask players to create new save files to effectively use any part of the content you add in a paid DLC, and then limit their slots so severely that they have to buy a flash drive or whatever. I'm not even sure why there are such severe restrictions on the easy mode and pro mode menus in the first place. Sure, I couldn't get all of the merits if I could just use one of the premium menus in an existing file, but why force me to start from scratch just to play around with him? Maybe I don't want to go for the merits right now. And why can't I use either or both menus in a single file? Initially, one might argue that they could have a technical reason for not allowing that. That was what went through my head. But then, after you beat Yozora, you'll realize it unlocks the ability to use both easy mode and pro mode at once. But as far as my testing showed, this is only for the base game, limit cut, and secret episode chapters for that specific DLC save file. You still can't use both at once in the base game on New Game or New Game Plus, outside of maybe if you beat the game with one menu active and start a New Game Plus from that file and pick the other menu. And since you can't redo ReMind with a file that has completed ReMind, you can't use both on ReMind either, despite there being a ReMind section in the Pro menu. Honestly, I have no clue what's going on here, and I don't think they did either. It's so ridiculous that they couldn't have just allowed you to enable both menus at any time in any file if you've beaten the game or the DLC. I really don't understand the half-baked implementation of all of this stuff. It feels chaotic and scatterbrained. If I had to guess, this is the result of the DLC production being rushed, likely because they had this pack planned before launch, which they would get started on after they patched things, but the severity of the issues people had in the base game meant fixes delayed production on the DLC. Either that, or these were fairly last-minute additions in response to the complaints about the lack of challenge and difficulty options in the base game, but these options themselves were rushed. Anyway, I suppose it's also worth noting that they made some very, very minor changes to scenes during the climax of the game, which primarily consist of aesthetic differences. Nothing too special, and it's really up to you whether you think they're an improvement or not. Okay, so beyond all of these extras, there are 3 main chapters in the DLC. Since ReMind is the first one, it makes the most sense to start there. It's also the one that houses the bulk of the story content, so let's discuss that for a bit. ReMind's plot follows Sora after the end of KH3, where he attempts to use the power of waking to bring Kairi back after Xehanort kills her. Mickey warns that the power of waking isn't meant to be used like that, and it could have dire consequences for Sora, but Sora is determined to help her anyway. The scene on Destiny Islands at the very end of the base game tells us that he was successful, but that it did indeed leave Sora missing. So ReMind follows the journey that brought them to that point, which consists of Sora traveling between the hearts of the other Guardians of Light during the climax of the base game. For some reason Chirithy doesn't explain, this will allow him to make his way to Kairi's heart. It also effectively means the player is tasked with playing through the entire Keyblade Graveyard segment again, with a few minor changes and some added scenes. For me, this was extremely painful and frustrating. The longer it went on, the more upset I got at the idea that people were potentially spending $30 on the chance to replay the end of the game again. The new cutscenes are interspersed between the rest of the normal scenes from the base game, which means you basically have to watch everything again or risk missing something new. But nearly all of the new scenes are completely filler, and do almost nothing but show us at which moments Sora jumps to which heart. While these scenes don't necessarily drag things down, they usually don't justify all of the extra time you're spending rewatching everything else, because they don't provide real revelations or forward movement for the plot of the chapter. They could have easily just added the sparkly effect of Sora jumping from one heart to another in the existing scenes, and the same effect would have been achieved. Even a lot of the other scenes that are important aren't actually important and don't provide valuable information. Most of these important scenes are geared toward explaining things that were left kind of open in the base game, like how Xion came back, or how Roxas found a replica body, but they don't often really show us anything we couldn't have guessed at. Wow, you mean Xehanort used a replica body for Xion, and then they put her data into it? I never would have guessed. I thought Marluxia and Luxord fell in love and adopted her from an orphanage before realizing who she actually was. I feel like this was purely included so they could make the "lol, she's imaginary" comment with calling her number I. Doesn't stop there either. You mean Roxas found his way out of Sora's heart and into the replica body at the last minute? I never would have guessed.
Does it really matter that he was released from Sora's heart by the time-traveling ReMind Sora? All that really does is raise more questions about how that's supposed to work. Honestly, this scene could have played out the exact same way in the base game. Instead, inside base game Sora's heart, and the effect would have been identical. This doesn't actually explain anything that needed an explanation. It's redundant and obvious. You could maybe make an argument for it being relevant that Naminé is the one who called upon Lingering Will, but the DLC doesn't explain how she does so, and the act itself was already something we learned in the base game, so once again, showing us that doesn't change or add anything meaningful other than that it gets ReMind Sora's grubby little fingers caught up in it. Knowing she called upon Lingering Will is the same as assuming he just felt the presence of his original body and heart, because remember, Lingering Will is shown to exist and be intact in KH2, so in reality, not tying it to Naminé makes it a stronger moment, because that makes it feel like his sheer lingering will to get his body and heart back brought him to the Keyblade Graveyard, though that still doesn't explain why he only shows up after everyone dies. Instead, they have him and ReMind Sora go off into the distance to fight Terranort. That explains why Lingering Will isn't present going forward because he's defeated, though once again, considering Terranort showed up later in the base game and Lingering Will didn't, that much was also obvious. So as per usual, all this does is raise more questions, because now ReMind Sora is involved. Chirithy tells Sora that he shouldn't be trying to change the past, because Destiny has a plan. He warns that Sora can disappear forever if he abuses this to save Kairi, despite Sora already using time travel to change the past once and save 6 people on top of saving himself. But apparently this time it'll have dire effects. So naturally, less than 10 minutes after we learn this rule, Sora breaks it by fighting Terranort to affect the past. Why? What did this add but more questions? Why doesn't this make Sora disappear, but bringing Kairi back does? Is the taboo reviving completely lost hearts, or changing the past? How does Chirithy even know the exact amount of hearts that will finally cause Sora to disappear? Sora mentions time traveling just like you to Terranort, so that raises the question as to why Xehanort hasn't disappeared for breaking time travel rules, altering time, and effectively bringing lost hearts back to the present. Where is the line where these rules are broken, and where is it Destiny so that it's considered okay? And how does Chirithy know which is which? Also, it's worth noting that the changes to time that Sora is supposedly making don't actually change anything, considering we can assume he's the only reason Naminé went to the final world, the only reason Roxas was able to come back, etc. So would this not still technically be part of the destiny of the world, since it already happened this way? If so, that means we already know he saved Kairi, which means he's not breaking a taboo of nature. So much of it feels like sloppy additions designed for nothing more than putting checkmarks next to arbitrary goals, rather than adding anything of value to the actual story events. Before this, we have a scene where Luxord questions Xigbar about why they're concerned with the box. Nothing comes of this scene either, really, because it takes place before Luxord is defeated and before Xigbar actually comes across the box. Since Luxord already knew about the box, having been tasked with finding it, there's little value in knowing he's questioning the motives behind the job he's been assigned, because he knows about the box and then he dies. This also gets brought up briefly a couple scenes later, and despite it sounding like Xigbar is keeping something from everyone else, Old Man Xehanort doesn't seem concerned about it. We'll touch back on that in a moment, but first we have to touch on the scene that upset me the most, which ties into this. The absolute biggest insult of a scene, and one of the few that actually has some value, is the one between the Master of Masters and young Xehanort. In this scene, Master of Masters tells Xehanort his name. Obviously, they don't want the player to know his name yet though, so in a baffling editing choice, they simply silence the audio so that we can't hear him. They literally just break the fourth wall with no excuse as for why. It feels cheap when a simple solution would have been to just zoom in on Master of Master's face, like they do, have him say, "My name is," and then have the camera whip up into the sky, only to then drop back down to settle on the first shot of the next scene, which is a similar close-up of Old Man Xehanort's face as he stands in almost the exact same spot.
Don't forget, by the way, we already know Xemnas' time isn't over, since he's plotting something about the Keyblade legacy of some of the other Org members. And they also revealed around the time of ReMind's release that they're making a mobile experience that centers around Xehanort, exploring him more deeply. Combine all of this with the scene earlier where Xigbar's intentions are called into question in front of Xehanort, and fans who genuinely believed the claims that Xehanort was done with and the Darkseeker saga was over have basically been kicked in the face. People who genuinely wanted a fresh start with future installments aren't going to get that. Xehanort's response to Xigbar's search for the box either implies that he's a terrible leader that doesn't see betrayal staring him in the face despite being omniscient everywhere else, or, considering all the other information, Xehanort is in on the search for the box, meaning this too is part of his plan in some way. Since they also made it a point to show us that he knows who the Master of Masters is, that means it's important that Xehanort specifically knows his identity, because otherwise we could just as easily get that information from Xigbar, since he's Lushu. The identity of the Master of Masters has become one of the most important things in the series. They're not going to reveal it in some random mobile experience. It'll likely be in a main game, meaning Xehanort is likely going to reveal it to us in a main game. Otherwise, that scene between the two has no value. About the only scenes that give us something new and engaging in the ReMind chapter are the ones that start at Scala. They focus mostly on ReMind Sora trying to find Kairi, with some secondary stuff that highlights how the others got on while Sora was fighting Old Man Xehanort. ReMind Sora meddles in this too, which, once again, provides nothing of value to these scenes. We could have genuinely just played out the scenes of the rest of the gang trying to stop Kingdom Hearts and fighting the 13 Armor Bros the exact same way without ReMind Sora's involvement, and the effect would have been the same. At this point, this isn't new narrative content, so much as just alternate perspectives that are muddied up with convoluted time travel shenanigans. Time travel shenanigans that, I should remind you, set ground rules that were immediately broken and continue to be broken throughout. This is all fluff. I'm sure that somewhere, in some obscure corner of the series, there are dumb explanations for all of the examples I brought up here and in the section about the base game story, but that's not really good enough. 9 times out of 10, motivations, character actions, and events should make sense without requiring tiny little lore bits hidden in journals or Ultimanias or whatever. And that brings us to the ultimate question, which is, why did this DLC's story content need to exist in the first place? We knew Sora succeeded in bringing back Kairi, but lost himself in the process after the ending of the base game. So whether his journey got him involved in all of these extra events or not, the ending is the same. This is literally all filler, but it's filler that's written terribly because they can't keep their rules in line. Let's assume for a second that they instead made all of the pointless stuff valuable, and imagine how they could do that. In the current version of the DLC, Xion is just random data they had lying around shoved into a replica. But what if instead, this was part of Terranort's instructions at the beginning of the Keyblade Graveyard segment? What if Xion was only brought back because Xemnas tells Terranort to decimate Sora and his friends so completely that, in his sorrow and death, Sora's heart is opened long enough to extract the information that belonged to Xion. In that sense, Sora is unwillingly used to create their 13th vessel as they originally wanted. Doesn't that sound a little bit more engaging and tie into the themes better? Then we could say, because of this, after reviving everybody and going back in time, Sora is actually missing that part of his heart. Then later, as they're facing off against Xemnas, Xion, and Saïx, Roxas is able to escape from that hole in Sora's heart, created by Xion's absence. Now that both Xion and Roxas are their own beings again, their ties to the hearts of their friends are restored, and this also restores Sora's heart to whole, allowing them all to live as separate, whole entities. That would tie in so well to the relationship between the 3 characters, wouldn't it? But nah, instead she's just made of some data Vexen probably had laying around on a table in a USB flash drive, and they had an extra vessel laying around. How cool, right? Like I said earlier, they could have also made it so that Naminé doesn't call to Lingering Will. Instead, Lingering Will comes back because he's a fucking lingering will that senses his body and heart have returned. I don't care if Naminé calling him back was told to us in the base game. Change it, because it's better this way. What thematic tie do these two characters even have with each other? Also, instead of Naminé just wandering stuck in the dive to the heart, or whatever's going on in that scene, what if she was simply already lost to the final world when Kairi died in the fight with Terranort? Simple. How about if Xehanort knows the Master of Masters but doesn't get the chance to ask his name, nor hear about Xigbar's search for the box behind his back? Done. Same questions being answered, and I'd argue answered much better. Sure, it still relies on the same old Kingdom Hearts convoluted nonsense, but at least it gives more weight and meaning to the answers you're given. It ties back into the themes well. Done that way, this also doesn't require ReMind Sora's time-traveling intervention all the time, so he's not changing the future and muddying everything up with more questions, which means the DLC would instead be free to focus on ReMind Sora trying to find proper moments to move between everyone's hearts, in ways that allow him to see and better understand why all of these Deus Ex Machinas occurred in the first place, rather than causing them himself. He doesn't have to break the rules of his time travel this way until the very end. Instead, the story would initially lead him to where Kairi's heart is hidden in the final world, and here is where using his power of waking in an unorthodox way would return Kairi to the present time in his place, leaving him stuck in the final world. He could also still send Chirithy back with her, so Chirithy can be with Ventus and whatever. That would mean he doesn't break the rules of nature until it actually comes to saving Kairi. And doesn't that just mean so much more? Similar to when he releases his heart in KH3 to save her, this is the ultimate sacrifice he's making for one of his closest friends, instead of just another example of him breaking time travel rules along the way. Anyway, from that point on, you could show that Sora spends some time exploring the final world, until he runs across to Azora and the secret episode plays out like normal. Again, isn't this just an improvement over the squandered mess we actually got? Should we really be happy with what we got? I struggle to see why so many fans were upset when Dream Drop Distance introduced time travel, making everything significantly more wobbly and convoluted. But when KH3 does it, twice, one of which is the backbone of a pointless narrative arc in paid DLC, suddenly it's a fantastic addition. Have our standards of storytelling in this series really dropped that low? I mean, heck, even the pacing was almost identical to the base game, which everyone complained about. So KH3 is horribly paced because nothing happens until the very end, but ReMind isn't poorly paced, despite 85% of the runtime being dedicated to vapid nothingness and stuff repeated from the base game, with all of the important stuff happening at the very end. They genuinely sold you like an hour and a half of cutscenes you already owned, and then an extra 30 minutes of stuff that ranges from meaningless and unnecessary to massively undercooked and uninspired. And all of it is covered in more questions than it answers. That is not okay. I'm putting my foot down, in fact. That is straight up terrible. I honestly feel like they only repeated so much content because they wanted to literally remind people of what happened at the end of the base game, and to justify the high price. But how many people, like myself, played through the game again as a refresher right before the DLC released? What is the theater for if not reminding you of the events by allowing you to watch them again? Heck, the structure of the ReMind chapter doesn't even make long-term sense, because if someone is going to play through the DLC again for the story years from now, they too will likely play the base game again, meaning they still have to deal with the incessant repetition of watching and playing the ending twice in a row. And any new people who buy the game with the DLC in the future, when they inevitably package it as KH3 Final Mix, like we know they will also be required to do the ending twice back to back. Remember, you can't play ReMind unless you've beat the base game. That is the fate of all future complete playthroughs of this game. Why? A lot of people are saying the story stuff from the ReMind chapter should have just been in the base game, and
I guess, but I don't know that I completely agree, mostly because that would require that something of substance actually happened in ReMind, which it really doesn't until you get to Scala, and even if that wasn't the case, a lot of the ReMind chapter isn't particularly noteworthy anyway, as we'll get to when we start discussing the combat. Things would probably have been essentially the same if the ReMind chapter just straight up didn't exist. Once again, there are several smaller direction issues along the way, too. Every time Nomura makes a mistake, he has to try and fix it by pretending it wasn't a mistake, even if it makes things worse. A perfect example in ReMind is a journal entry they added that confirms Keyblade Masters set the Mark of Mastery exam for their students themselves. This was clearly their way of finally making sense of the discrepancies between the task Ericus sets for Aqua and Terra and what Yen Sid has Sora and Riku do in Dream Drop Distance. But what that actually means is that Ericus literally just thought hitting a bunch of orbs was enough. We joke about that, but it's true. He even lets Ventus interfere and recognizes that someone tampered with the orbs during the test. But that's completely okay, I guess. Fine by me though, because Ericus always was an incompetent failure. I also don't feel like adding the few seconds of Kairi getting the upper hand against Xemnas makes up for wasting her potential so much in the base game. Playing as her helps in some ways, because she mechanically feels nice to use, but in other ways it kind of hurts, because she still ultimately does almost nothing and doesn't really use all that power elsewhere. She's still playing second fiddle in that battle technically, because we all know Sora is the lead. Clearly, she can't accomplish anything without her man by her side. I personally also kind of feel like they once again dabbled in anti-consumer marketing. It's frankly not really okay that the Final Fantasy characters are so underutilized. What we saw in the trailers is basically all there is. I don't want to outright call this false advertising, unlike what they did with the box in the base game. But it does feel deceptive, considering they preyed on the fact that people really wanted to see Final Fantasy characters return, only to massively underdeliver. It's genuinely just a single room with 4 Final Fantasy characters who each have a handful of lines. We don't even know if the data fights help them in their quest to learn where Sora went. Before we finally move to ReMind gameplay, I might as well throw my hat into the ring when it comes to the theories for what happens next. So here's my Verum Rex Yozora theory. I don't think he's technically part of Kingdom Hearts at all. I think he's the main character of a new game called, get this, Verum Rex, which is a Dissidia-style fighting game that will collect Square characters beyond just Final Fantasy together en masse. That could also be why they've started to explore other Kingdom Hearts characters and their fighting styles on current hardware, to include them in Verum Rex. Heck, maybe it's just Dissidia Verum Rex, I don't know. I think Yozora is actually a real person from our world, or more specifically, the version of our world that exists in Toy Story. I think he was thrust into a game world when the world of Toy Story was split into 2. This is why Verum Rex is present in only Toy Box. It's why when he first meets Sora, he's surprised Sora recognizes him as he looks, because he doesn't actually look like a handsome anime boy. Yozora is supposed to represent us, the player. That's why one eye is blue and one eye is red. It symbolizes the duality of the relationship between player and character, as well as the split in his world that got him stuck in the game in the first place. He's first presented to us in a video game in the base game, right? And in the secret episode, he appropriates Sora's lines about having weird thoughts and questioning whether everything he's seeing is real or not. He admits to not living in this strange new city, but rather being put here against his will, being put through trials, and then is told by someone else to save Sora. Maybe the main villain of the game Yozora is stuck in can access and ravage the worlds of others who are stuck in the game, and maybe the best way for Yozora to stop him from making his way to the world of Kingdom Hearts is to defeat Sora so that he's no longer in the game. Another ally must have warned him that Sora is coming for that reason. If he does defeat Sora like in the bad ending, Yozora wakes up believing he's back in the real world too, but he's actually still stuck in the game. If he doesn't, he wakes up in the real world and now Sora is stuck in the game. As many have speculated, the fact that Verum Rex is originally shown as a game that has strong visual ties to Final Fantasy Versus 13 could be an allusion to Nomura and some potential resentment towards Square for not being able to finish this title. So maybe the bad guy is the game publisher themselves, and they've been harnessing some dark powers for personal gain. They want to rule all worlds, similar to how Square has bought up many second-party studios in the last decade, and to some perspectives, could maybe be neglecting their normal studios. The secret episode is subtitled Falsus Rex in the theater menu, which is Latin meaning false king. This potentially alludes to the fact that the world they're in is indeed fake, but it could also point towards Sora being the metaphorical fake king in the secret episode. Since this chapter takes place in Kingdom Hearts 3, and Sora is the main character of Kingdom Hearts, we're actually able to defeat Yozora here, freeing him from the game. But this is a false ending for a false king, Sora, because in Verum Rex, it isn't Sora's story to be in charge of. Only the Verum Rex, the one true king, Yozora, the player, can band everyone together to beat the villain controlling the game. And that will happen in a crossover party fighter Square is in the early stages of developing. Stupid, right? Okay, ReMind gameplay time, finally. So the best place to start with this is probably with the changes to the base game that come with ReMind and the free update. As part of said update, players gain access to a multitude of new combo attacks and a new finisher. They also added the Oblivion and Oathkeeper Keyblades, which are functionally nearly identical. Oblivion is obtained by beating Critical Mode, and Oathkeeper by finding 90 lucky emblems. Oblivion's first form change is Dark Form, while Oathkeeper's is Light Form. Both are fast and powerful, and the differences are functionally just aesthetic, outside of maybe very specific circumstances. Both share the same second form change, where you get to use both Keyblades at once. This too is a very fast and powerful form, Double Form. As a whole, these are two of my favorite Keyblades in the game now. They channel the swift, combo-centric feel I loved from second form really well, and Double Form reminds me just a bit of Anti-Form and Rage Form with its occasional multi-hit long-range attacks. Beyond this, the update also offers a large amount of new combo abilities. Thankfully, these new attacks kinetically feel absolutely fantastic. They're fast, powerful, and seem a lot safer than the previous options because of it. It makes Sora's base form combos much less boring and more potent. You also get them all from the beginning in New Game Plus, but interestingly, you seem to unlock them naturally over the course of the game from a brand new file, so that progression still feels well paced. All of that might lead one to believe that your old combo options become completely useless. And you know, that might kind of be true, but it's really hard to say right now. What's important is that they don't replace the original options in the ability list, so you can freely mix and match to create combo chains that rival KH2, if not outright beat it in terms of variety. The big difference between the two is that KH2 used combo modifiers for a lot of these options. This meant players had much greater control over which attack to use when, even when all of the options were equipped at once. That's not the case in KH3, as all of the new abilities are automatically used based on context while mashing X. As such, you kind of have more options but less control. Still, this is a massive improvement over the base game. And it doesn't stop there, because they also changed the properties of the old combo options, meaning they're much more viable. I don't know all of the specifics, but as far as my testing showed, the major change was that they finally made it so that every finisher that isn't Magic Flash can now be cancelled into a block or an aerial dodge. Previously, equipping these alternative finishers replaced your combo plus attacks, because finish plus abilities are not a thing in KH3. What this meant was that as you added finishers, you could cancel fewer and fewer attacks in your combo into a block or aerial dodge. You'd go from having up to 5 normal attacks that all cancel, and then 1 finisher that couldn't be cancelled, to having 3 normal attacks that all cancel, and 3 painfully slow and unsafe finishers that don't cancel. This new change makes things like Triple Rush and Speed Slash actually useful in normal combat, rather than detrimental. The other 2 base game additions are the premium menus, Easy Menu and Pro Menu. These require the DLC, and like I said, they can only be activated one at a time on new files, New Game Plus files, or otherwise, outside of the brief exceptions we talked about before.
The menus themselves are, to some extent, a waste. Let's go through what options each menu has really quickly. First, easy menu. You've got an option to one-shot basically every enemy, bosses included, an option to block attacks automatically as long as you aren't currently attacking yourself, HP, MP, and focus regen, an option that makes it so that you gain situation command arrows passively, options that make attractions, team attacks, and rage form more common, as well as one that makes links last longer. There's an option for making all abilities cost 0 AP, and an option that triples all magic and physical damage, enemies included. Finally, there are 3 other toggles for non-combat focused buffs. Cooking Master makes it so that you always get an excellent rating when cooking, Shop Discount makes all shop items half price, and Gummy Ship Meister sets your gummy level to 99 and gives you maximum inventory for every gummy block. This menu is largely inoffensive because it does the job it's supposed to do. What's more, the option to triple all magic and physical attack damage is an interesting way to actually make the game more difficult. It's the only dynamic option on the list because it allows you the benefit of doing way more damage, but risks dying in one hit on difficulties like critical. The merits in the easy menu are related to accomplishing specific tasks, like killing over 20 shadows or neo shadows with a single use of rage form, or defeating at least 13 enemies without touching the ground or using things like links. Unlocking these merits gets you nothing but bragging rights and a trophy as far as I can tell. So now let's run through the pro menu options really quickly. In the Pro menu, you can make it so that your stats are all level 1 stats regardless of your level. You can make the base defense for your party 0, make your HP and or MP drain over time, the latter of which also doubles MP charge times. You have the option to independently disable shot locks, cure, item usage when in combat, links, grand magic and form changes, attractions, team attacks, and or Kupo coins. And finally, you can enable an equip limit of 30 abilities regardless of excess AP you may have. Once again, pretty much only one of these options has any dynamism. That would be the one that keeps your stats at level 1, even when your characters level up. This is actually interesting because it allows you to play with level 1 stats while still getting all of the abilities you'd normally get when you level. As an ironic counter to the easy menu option that makes the game harder, this makes level 1 runs easier, but could also make them more fun to strategize around because of the extra abilities. The HP and MP drain abilities aren't too bad either, nor is the ability limit, I guess, but they're pretty simple in effect, so provide little depth on their own. Other than that though, basically all of the pro menu stuff is reductive. They all take options away, which sure is more difficult, but it doesn't challenge the existing mechanics you have access to, it just removes most of them to put further strain on others. And unlike the critical converter ability they added along with crit, these options don't give you an interesting benefit as a trade-off. I tried crit with the pro menu completely enabled, and while I'm sure it's possible to beat this way, I don't see the reason to use it myself. Even on beginner, while it's decently less brutal than using the pro menu on crit, it's still equally bland because you're still just removing options. And since the crit specific abilities are crit specific, your moveset becomes even more basic on beginner. All I can do is spam basic spells and combos, so what's the point? You might argue, well, you don't have to use all of the options at once, but the trophy can only be obtained by reaching the max merit level, which as far as I can tell, requires having all pro menu options enabled at once. In the Pro menu, instead of having merit objectives, you simply gain experience as you beat certain parts of the game with Pro menu options active. You gain more experience if you activate more options, and different options dole out different amounts of experience. You only get experience from specific fights, usually bosses, so you can't optionally grind mobs to level. Naturally, you'd think, this being a challenge-centric menu, you'd at least unlock something special for raising your merit level. As far as I can tell, that's a no here too. You once again only get bragging rights and the trophy, and only if you enable all of the options for the whole playthrough. Now, as I've mentioned already, you seemingly can't use both the Pro and Easy menus at once outside of the Limit Cut and Secret episodes, or that single file in the base game. Again, it's possible that you unlock the option to use both at once if you beat the game with one menu and then use it as your basis for a New Game Plus file where you pick the other menu. Although I tried starting from a DLC file that had access to both menus, and it didn't work that way. Even if that's the case though, I think it's ridiculous that they'd try to force you to do that anyway, and I'm not about to play through the entire game again just to test it. I already had to go through the tutorial section around 8 times just to test everything else related to these menus and the new combo options, which was torture. I shouldn't have had to do that at all. It's absolutely ludicrous that they'd place these restrictions on this content, because none of it feels consistent. It's just confusing. The thing I don't understand is why they didn't give us more dynamic and interesting options. Even if we had fewer to choose from, that would still be better than this. Why not let us choose base damage percentages for individual ability types like links or spells, so we can actually tailor the game to our preferences? That would give us some nuanced control over the things we feel need nerfed or buffed. The way it is now, you basically shoot all the way to way too easy or all the way to way too hard and uninteresting. Or what about an option to make Kupo coins cost one of Sora's levels instead of a paltry amount of money at the shop? Why not have an option that makes it so that you can only heal by siphoning health from enemies through finishers? That option could also make it so that all health prizes are turned into money or MP prizes as a benefit for having it enabled. Or what about a toggle that makes it so enemies enter a high-powered state where their strength, magic, and defense grow if they're not killed fast enough, like Dante Must Die mode in the DMC games? Also, why can't players have the option to gain pro mode experience points during normal combat, so players have the choice to either turn more modifiers on at once to earn points faster, or grind lower point totals to get merit levels if they're struggling. And then they could tie cool little extras to merit levels. Instead of having them literally mean nothing, maybe you could unlock enemy color palette changes. Or they could have even brought back the character decoration stuff from 0.2 as progression rewards. What we have here is almost completely a waste, and it's confusingly implemented on top of everything. Next up, we should touch on the extra characters you can use during the ReMind chapters. This was heavily advertised as a major thing in the DLC, and many people were excited by the prospect of trying out their favorite characters. As I said, I fully expected them to be shallow to play with. And what do you know, they are. It's just fan service, which is fine, but hardly worth the asking price for me. They also still don't allow you to customize the shortcut menu for other allies. If you're gonna break up the battles with cutscenes and stuff that break the pace up so often, you can also break it up with a short little menu option before the battle starts when you're playing as that character that just allows you to tweak stuff. I was constantly tripped up by Cure being mapped to triangle, where I usually map it to square. The fights also come with some new team attacks which look cool, but are just more AoE flash. The characters you can actually play as are Riku, Aqua, Roxas, and Kairi. That's it, meaning 2 of them were already playable in the base game, and both of them play exactly as they did in the base game too. Heck, don't forget that Aqua was also the character you played as in 0.2, so playing as her is nothing special, because it's basically the same as it was there. One thing I noticed was that every alternate character they let you play as in a real fight is similar in size to Sora, giving me the impression they might have used Sora's rig for all of their battle animations. That would be a smart way to simplify the development effort, but if that's the case, why not allow Sora to share their movesets by giving us their Keyblades if we complete the battles in ReMind using that character? It would literally be like using D-Links again, but using the form change system instead. Having one fight with each of these characters, sometimes which lasts less than 30 seconds, isn't really worth much. It's just as much of a tease as it was to play as Riku in the original game, or Aqua in the original game. The only other place where you play as alternate characters is in the big battle with the whole group and the Mickey bit. These sections, as well as the part where you link all the keyholes together as Sora, are beautiful, but they're also all flash, no substance, take quite a lot of time, and aren't skippable. You don't get any choices in the group fight. It moves you to characters and reaction commands in a set order, and you can't really benefit from not moving forward. So it's more or less like 7 or 8 minutes of QuickTime event where you mash X and occasionally press square triangle.
This would be fine, but again, it is forced on you every time you want to get to the limit cut or secret episode with a new file, despite being identical every time. The Mickey segment is the same way, and it just drags and drags for like 3 or 4 minutes longer than it needs to, honestly. The keyhole thing can thankfully take less than a minute, since there's no punishment for just flailing the stick around and mashing the X button. But together, they're all probably 10 to 15 minutes of interactive cutscene that were already tedious by the time I had to redo them on Critical. At least the fight with Goat Nort using Kairi and Sora is engaging. It's functionally pretty different from what you got originally, and I much prefer the design here. As I said earlier, playing as Kairi doesn't really make up for how she was treated before, and her gameplay is still simplified compared to Sora. But she has access to all of the magic, I believe, and her own shotlock, unlike Roxas. She also has a teleport combo opener like Roxas does, which kind of feels like an automatic air step. She's nothing special, but her combos feel snappy like Sora's new ones do, so I approve of this fight overall. I just wish there was a way to play a more challenging version of it using Sora without going through the entire game again and staying underleveled through everything preceding this one fight. I also wish I didn't have to play through all of ReMind just to get to it. On Crit, it's plenty challenging with Kairi, but with Sora, it was kind of a joke at level 60. Honestly, all of the ReMind episode was. The entire ReMind episode is kind of a joke. I played through it first on standard at level 99, since that was my most complete file. I expected it to be easy, I'm not gonna pretend I didn't. However, what I didn't expect was the enemies to all be basically the same strength as they were in the actual ending. In fact, I thought the Dark Inferno refight was straight up going to be harder, but nearly every battle in ReMind, including that one, was over in about a minute or less, and none of it was much harder on Crit either, despite my relatively middling level. Obviously, you have access to harder versions of most of these fights with Limit Cut, but they couldn't have at least lit a small fire under them in ReMind? It makes a lot of the gameplay kind of just feel like busy work. Exploring Scala itself before the climax is fine, but there's nothing special outside of the aesthetic. You get a single, decently large cell to explore, with lots of nooks and crannies, as well as a small underground tunnel section and a few puzzles to solve. However, the area is pretty empty otherwise, hiding just 9 chests and a bunch of generic mob fights with enemies you've already fought a million times before. And remember, all these enemies are gonna be cake. On top of this, it's capped off with yet another Darkseid fight, which I'm getting so tired of at this point. At least do something new with him one of these times, please. There's a reason he was the tutorial boss in Kingdom Hearts 1 20 years ago, and it's not because he was challenging. That's literally all you get in the ReMind episode. A cut down, less engaging fight with Dark Inferno, an extra fight with Terranort that's hardly different, a repeat of most of the ending content from the base game, a single new fight with Goat Nort, and some interactive cutscene bits. I greatly dislike most of the ReMind chapter. I truly do. Once you get to Scala, it improves to the point that it becomes bearable to mediocre. You get a taste of what so many of us were actually hoping to see. Honestly, had they skipped all of the Keyblade graveyard stuff and instead written it so that Sora just had to go to Scala to find Kairi's heart from the beginning, and then expanded Scala and added like 2 new boss fights beyond the new Goat Nort, I'd have been much more happy with it. It's disappointing that the bulk of KH3's story-related DLC episode couldn't give us even just a few new areas to explore. I'm not asking for like 3 new worlds or something ridiculous like that. Just a fully explorable Scala with like 3 cells the size of the one we got. A story that isn't almost entirely recycled cutscenes, and a handful of new story bosses that are actually fights instead of interactive cutscenes or wastes of time that are underleveled. I mean, they made the one Scala cell already, meaning they have nearly all of the assets they'd require to expand it further, so why spend so much effort on repeating base game stuff with such little payoff? The only saving grace was the knowledge that, since I'd yet to see a Final Fantasy character, hadn't played more than 1 episode, and hadn't fought 13 new bosses, I knew there was more DLC. And with that, we finally reached the Limit Cut and Secret episodes. This is the stuff I was really the most hopeful for, considering by the end of the ReMind episode I knew the stuff I valued more still remained. Learning that the data fights were nearly all based on fights from the Keyblade Graveyard didn't fill me with confidence, particularly since, again, ReMind was leveled seemingly identically to the actual ending of the game. If ReMind bosses melted by just looking at them with my max level character on standard, did these data bosses really stand much of a chance? The answer is yes. Yes, they do. These bosses will likely kick your ass, even on standard. I was delighted to see that they did indeed all have rather massive alterations to their movesets, were much more fleshed out overall, and required a decent level of mastery to defeat. Yes, Raconius, you were right to some extent. I mean, they're still based on ancient, recycled bosses, and you can definitely see and feel that, but the level of execution the game asks of you here is ratcheted up to well past 11. Granted, I still think they could have and should have done something more interesting than the same old bosses again. That doesn't mean they can't be connected to the characters we already know in some way. I mean, have you ever noticed that, as far as I know anyway, we have never seen the Heartless that were created when the original Org members were turned into nobodies? They were powerful enough to maintain their forms as nobodies, so it should only stand to reason that their hearts would create powerful Heartless. Why couldn't those be the new fights for the applicable characters instead? Sure, Vanitas, Ansem, Old Man Xehanort, and a few other characters don't fit that idea, but that would still make like half the bosses completely new. Doesn't that sound more interesting than a fourth fight with Marluxia or whatever? I like him too, but I want something else. I also think it would have honestly been kind of cool if we could have gotten fights with Soras from KH1, 2, Dream Drop Distance, and 3, based on their respective movesets. Anyway, initially a lot of these bosses can feel arguably unfair, because many of them teleport around a lot. They use unblockable attacks fairly regularly, gain super armor and massive damage resistance whenever they're not vulnerable, are basically immune to link and spell damage, and some of them can lower your maximum health, which you then have to use a panacea and a healing item, a rare item like an elixir, or enter a form change to reset. Even if you wanted to spam spells or links, because of the teleporting and fast movement, you're unlikely to actually make contact with your target anyway. These battles are ruthless. It is worth noting really quickly that Saïx seems to be the only data fight that can basically be broken with an option outside of combos. Jumping on him with Simba during Berserk 2 means you're invincible. He'll take tons of damage, and you can stunlock him while the Berserk bar drops like a rock. Then you simply punish, and the fight basically starts back over from there. The same can be done to a much lesser degree to other fights when they have armor on, like Xion. But leaving the link can be really unsafe, and because they don't use the Berserk mechanic, you're not getting near as much of a boost. That actually brings up an interesting question related to the ReMind episode, because beating the battles there either gives you a boost to MP or another item slot. I can only assume the MP we get is for people playing on crit, since the community has complained as far back as 0.2 about the low MP in that difficulty mode. But if that's the case, why make us beat the game and the unrepeatable DLC chapter to get it? What's left at that point? More Dark Inferno? Sure, you could try to use it in the data fights, but remember what I just said. Trying to use magic as a core part of your damage dealing effort against these bosses is mostly a futile effort. You are genuinely better off just using combos, and that's also unfortunately the major problem with these fights. The core issue here is exemplified fairly succinctly by this brief clip during the Yozora fight. Notice how I dodge Yozora's attacks, he stands there unguarded for a second, I hit him to start a combo because that makes perfect sense in this situation, but he doesn't flinch and instead teleports out of my attack. Well, I did basically nothing but chip damage. That feels remarkably like Vanitas from BBS, because it's an arbitrary choice to give him super armor in that moment, a choice you can't strategize around as a player. This is otherwise an identical opening to half of his real openings, but he's randomly not vulnerable to stagger here, and therefore attacking will do nothing but chip damage. And this is a lenient false opening. Many of them guarantee you'll get punished for trying. And that begs the question, how do you even tell the difference between real openings and false openings without just slamming your head against the wall and taking every opportunity to attack? That requires dying over and over to find which openings work, and which see you massively punished. Some openings are made obvious, but these bosses regularly have hidden openings where very specific parts of an attack, again parts that look no different from the others, will leave the enemy secretly vulnerable for no reason other than that the devs wanted them to be. I don't see that as particularly good design. Syx and Ansem love to hang around doing nothing while they have super armor active. About half of the moments where they end an attack just aren't actually openings, and yet they'll just stand or float around a large amount of the time. I think there are several easy solutions to this issue. Firstly, they could make the animations where there's an opening slightly different, so that keen observation doesn't lead to the perception of false openings. This could be useful, for example, during Terranort's dash attack, which provides no real indication for the fact that blocking him from the ground generally just keeps you safe, while blocking him from the air will leave him open. A good example from him, though, is during his final phase unblockable combos. If you look closely during the second combo, one of his attacks isn't an unblockable, meaning you can block it and counter it. They could make openings more visibly consistent as well. Syx is only vulnerable every other time he slams down during his angry double berserk charge. I'd argue it's too difficult to see, but if you're right in there, you might be able to notice that he teleports away when he's not vulnerable. There are other fun little hints that they have included which can be a great indicator like this. For example, young Xehanort will occasionally do his time slow whip as a normal attack instead of a counter. If you notice, he seems to have a huge vulnerability period afterward. This should strike the player as odd, and indeed, if you try to attack him too early, it's actually just bait and he'll teleport away. The seeming ease with which you can counter him is a tip, hinting that you should maybe wait and try to catch him after the teleport, which is different from normal openings where you usually have to be super swift. Another example would be Yazora's opening during the attack where he uses a small sucking gun thing, teleports away and randomly does 2 sword slashes, followed by 3 shots of targeted needles in an X formation, and then the sucking gun thing again. The hint is in the sword slashes, which under normal circumstances will never hit you. He's always way too far away. The player should be asking why he would do this then. Well, if you head to where he did the slashes and then attack him immediately after the needle shots, he teleports back to this spot, allowing you to find a very small opening before he uses the sucky gun thing again. These sorts of openings are great because they're about observation and then execution based on your observations. The third thing they could do is highlight the character with a colored aura when they have super armor after an attack, similar to how Sora is highlighted in red on crit after you just guard. This could even play into the design by powering up the next attack the boss does if you're dumb enough to attack them when they're glowing, again similar to how critical counter works. I'd be curious to see how many of the speedrunners and such actually figured out about all of these secret openings themselves, and how many were figured out piecemeal by the community on accident, and then packaged into a solid strategy later. Because the ultimate point I'm making here is that I don't think a lot of this is clear enough for an individual to really parse out to the degree the community as a whole has. Regardless, what you'll quickly figure out as you experiment in these fights is that they very much want to be fought one way and one way only. While these bosses do fix issues with things like Link or magic spam to a large degree, the developers also balance the fights by devaluing player options. They made the spammable options so impractical that you kind of have to fight them on their terms. Instead of diversifying by maybe making this boss weak to these options and that boss strong against the same options, everyone is weak to blocking, dodging, and punishing with combos, and only when their very specific vulnerable moments come up. Most of your form changes are likely just as risky or useless as Link's in Magic because of the speed and ferocity of the bosses. You don't really want slow hammer attacks against these guys. Not that they'd likely do much more damage, if any at all. This only further proves just how much of a problem it is that most of your combat options are flashy AoE or projectile damage, when all of these options work similarly, and those similar features are what make them overpowered. The only way to balance them is to nuke them out of existence. When one is nerfed, they're all nerfed. But once you do that, you're left with a significantly smaller arsenal of options to build fights around. It's like they heard that people were tired of Osaka titles having weak combos, so they nerfed everything else and then designed a slew of fights that only respond to combos. It feels like every reaction Osaka team gives to fan criticism is an overreaction. That's not to say there aren't secret little options and exploits to find for those that experiment a bit. I mean, I learned while browsing people's thoughts online that using fire magic when Marluxia's got armor on will deplete the armor immediately, when he's not in his DM. You can use Thunder on Luxord's smashy cards to destroy them, and you can skip Vanitas' entire DM by knocking him off his Keyblade surfboard right before the DM starts. Other than Luxord's cards though, and the aforementioned hints during the young Xehanort and Yozora fights, there's often no clear hint for any of these secrets. Sometimes there's no discernible hint at all, and other times it's something as minor as the character briefly teleporting somewhere new amidst the chaos of a bunch of effects filling the screen. But at least they're engaging to some degree. Suddenly you'll want to try to strategize around having your MP up at the right times, so you can cast the necessary spells at certain moments, or use a link for an easy way to avoid a DM. But most of these are just straight up boons rather than options that provide risks and rewards for different playstyles. Not skipping Vanitas' DM would just be stupid if you know about the option and can execute it. There's no give and take. Don't get me wrong, this sort of hyper-focused design with specific demands has its place, as games like Super Meat Boy or Guitar Hero have illustrated. But it's not what I personally was hoping for with this DLC. I wanted opponents that rewarded a variety of strategies, options that could effectively play into those strategies, and just enough leeway so that experimentation was viable beyond top-level play or using exploits. And right now, I don't feel like we got that. Instead, we got 14 puzzles to solve. Ultimately, there's not much making it your own here. You execute better, or you simply don't execute and you fail instead. An interesting note is that the speedrunning community seems to absolutely be eating these fights up, and that's totally great for them. Ninten866 summed up the general sentiment many of them seem to be having rather well. While this sentiment holds true, it doesn't really change the fact that it's a bandage on the larger balancing problems Osaka team don't seem to be interested in fixing. Even combos have exploit issues in base KH3, which they had to find a way to nullify for the data fights. In my first video, you might remember that I mentioned how severely overpowered Payback Strike is as an Ukemi move. Payback Strike has an enormous magnetic range that sucks you toward the enemy you're countering, hits a multitude of times in a large radius, does this over a long period of time, gives you a fair bit of safety and invulnerability, and therefore can easily catch enemies again right after they retaliate, punishing them for basically hitting you once. This makes it easy to get free counters on nearly any attack that hits you in the base game. You can therefore kinda just repeat the cycle endlessly to get free, brainless combo damage until you need to heal. Because of this, they made the openings on these bosses so strict that you can't do that. Thanks to the super armor, spamming Payback Strike will only be effective if you tag them during one of their pre-designated openings by chance. In the meantime, you'll be taking lots of damage, leaving yourself open, and doing chip damage to them. I eventually took it off because I felt like it was getting me killed more often than not. Same with aerial dodge, which is frankly just awful in this game. Just using maxed out air slide is far better in most circumstances. It's great that moves like Payback Strike can no longer be abused, but as a result, you're left with bosses that tank a boatload of hits they probably shouldn't. Not to mention because basically every opening is during or after a chain of attacks the enemy dishes out, and are all by far most effectively exploited with combos, they all blend together. The pacing of every fight effectively turns into block or dodge a bunch, brief opening, air step, punish with combos until they break out, block or dodge a bunch, brief opening, air step, punish with combos until they break out, etc. Once you memorize the patterns, there's little left but execution, aside from the fact that bosses can often vary their attack order, which is nice, but still means memorization and execution are the order of the day. The rhythm of each attack pattern and boss may be different on a granular level, but the rhythm as a whole is the same across nearly every fight. It's extremely restrictive, and more or less the only way I've found to do damage outside of vulnerability periods is by chipping away with reprisals when it's safe during enemy combos. As such, the battles aren't dynamic, and there's very little strategy. Memorization and execution, memorization and execution, memorization and execution. Again, that's fine, but it's hardly what you get from KH2's best fights, and once again, this comes down to a lack of diverse options. If links are broken, you basically disallow links. If magic can be spammed, you disallow magic. If payback strike and flailing around are a bit too effective, you give everyone super armor that cannot be broken until you hit them during their pre-designated openings. As the player, you don't make openings in these data fights, you react to them. I'm not even sure why this is a necessary design choice on Crit, considering, at least at around level 62, they do so much damage that I found most attacks either take half or all of my HP instantly. So even if they just mirrored the way super armor and counters were implemented in KH2's data battles, that would mean spamming attacks and flailing around will leave you dead in seconds. In fact, I think they could have easily halved the damage most of the attacks currently do on Crit, and maybe even made some of them do as little as a quarter or a third, and the battles would have still been more than challenging enough for most people. Particularly because it's not like you can't still do them with the pro codes active or at level 1 if you wanted to. More challenge is always there for those who seek it, and with the pro code menu that allows you to have all the abilities at level 1, you can basically have everything most people have ever wanted that do level 1. And to be completely clear, I'm not trying to attack any of these speedrunners for their thoughts. I follow the work of a lot of these people, and despite my love-hate relationship with the Kingdom Hearts series, the KH speedrunning community is far and away my favorite. Biz is just straight up my favorite runner for any game in any series, period. They know these games well, and in this case, they got what they wanted. Battles that require a high level of skilled execution, that massively punish cheap or easy strategies that can serve as workarounds. Now, they can speedrun all of these fights in a way that still requires not turning their brain off or exploiting junky strategies. The biggest weakness of KH2's data fights is that they can be exploited and completely broken with a few really meta strategies. Here, it's all focused on high-level combo execution. So the person who's best at these fights is going to be the fastest. But I don't think that's all that's required for these fights to actually be great. I get it, they're shiny looking, fast and frenetic, and probably demand higher levels of execution than anything else in the series, and yet they really do seem to be missing a lot of the freedom to experiment that made KH2's data fights so well-rounded. In a sense, these fights are all the answer to the question, what if Mysterious Figure and the rest of BBS's worst fights were actually done well? They're fights that have one optimal strategy that you have to exploit to win, but this time the strategy isn't spam your invincible dodge roll and then spam surges to win. Like, I can't be the only one that sees these similarities, right? This is a large part of the thing that everybody used to criticize, and suddenly they're not. As such, I cannot in good faith, as of now, say that these fights are as well designed as those in 2FM. I think they're pretty darn good, highly polished for what they are, and much better than I thought Osaka Team could ever be able to do after they failed so miserably with KH3. I like these fights a lot, despite my criticisms, and they do elevate the DLC and the game as a whole quite a lot too. Learning the fights was fun. Executing them once you've mastered them is fun. Despite being repetitive, the rhythm of the execution is also spot on, but exploring them and plumbing their depths for anything beyond exploits doesn't really exist as an option. If you find KH2FM's data fights too easy because of their strategic variety, you can always artificially impose limitations that make them tougher, like level 1 or restricting abilities. Sure, it's artificial, but it's still an option. The same is true for KH3's data fights. However, strategic depth cannot be artificially added to KH3's data fights. They are what they are, and they're lacking strategic depth. I'd say they're like 3/4 of the way to true greatness, but 3/4 is still 75%, which is a C, and they have the failings of base KH3 to thank for that. Its ability design is still so rotten that it's difficult to really build something astonishing around it. That being said, these aren't really the only shortcomings these two episodes have either, since once again there are some smaller issues. Firstly, Luxord is still kind of a mess just like in KH2, because his DM is rather confusing and is highly based on luck. Also, some of his games don't really gel well with Sora's rather chaotic attack animations, so it's not uncommon to hit cards you didn't intend to, which doesn't feel fair because you take damage and miss an opportunity to attack. There's also a rather major issue with the floatiness of the game. Now that the mechanics have been taken to their logical extreme with super fast enemies that can juggle you while teleporting or darting around, it can be incredibly difficult to get back to the ground when you're knocked high into the air. And that matters in some instances because aerial dodge has a much longer cooldown than dodge roll, but many attacks these enemies have can't be blocked. Honestly, as of now, there aren't really any other small issues that I could find. For what they are, these fights are solid. They're not what I was hoping for, but they're just about the best I could have expected from Osaka Team. I also briefly want to mention the response the Kingdom Hearts community has had to ReMind reviews from major outlets like IGN and GameSpot. A lot of people are upset at the scores and overall sentiment from these reviews, which are middling at best. And some fans of the series are trying to argue that these reviews are invalid because the writers that actually played the DLC didn't finish the limit cut or secret episodes. This is pretty ludicrous and in some cases hypocritical if you ask me. Hear me out. You are not required to beat every part of an intentionally extremely difficult boss gauntlet in order to review a game or DLC, particularly if you're not doing a long-form analytical critique of the work as a whole. Many of the people criticizing IGN are happy grinding away hours and hours on this game, figuring out all the nuances and whatever it throws their way. It feels as if they're not thinking about this from any perspective but their own. They don't stop to think that there could potentially be a lot of preparation work that goes into just getting to limit cut in a state that's ready to take it on. As a more casual player on a limited schedule, if you don't currently have a completed file of the game on a difficulty you're comfortable with, you have no choice but to spend hours getting to that point before you can even start looking at limit cut. So you really think it's fair to expect that they have to beat these bosses on a higher difficulty than they're capable of doing, or else replay through the entire game to try it on an easier difficulty on a limited schedule when the base game in no way prepared them for such an extreme spike in difficulty anyway? I've also seen several big-name community members simultaneously argue that it's obvious that the bosses expect you to be at level 99, as if it's dumb to criticize limit cut just because most players probably can't beat the bosses at the level 50-ish they'd likely beat KH3 at. And yet they'll criticize these same outlets for complaining that they felt like they needed to grind to stand a chance, and even then it was still extremely punishing. So you can't complain that the DLC feels like it requires a grind for more casual players, but you also can't complain that the DLC struggles to work for these players at lower levels. You just have to accept that to get your money's worth out of this DLC, you have a grind ahead of you. I don't understand the gatekeeping, honestly. Have these fans stopped to think that maybe these reviews aren't aimed at the hardcore KH fan who has already played every single game on multiple difficulties, gotten the platinum trophies, have YouTube channels centered around the series, watch YouTube channels centered around the series, or even just revel in the idea of such challenging bosses? Have they ever thought that maybe these reviews are instead for people who didn't pre-order the DLC? Maybe because they're not sure whether it's worth their money on a personal level? Because newsflash, that's the point of these reviews. The thing is, these are consumer-oriented reviews, focused on helping people decide whether a purchase is worth their money. They're not analytical critique, and so complaints about the massive jump in difficulty are very justified, because there's nothing to prep the player for how sharp the difficulty spike is. Kingdom Hearts 3 didn't train anyone who wasn't extremely dedicated already to be able to beat these bosses, because it was painfully easy. And not everyone is going to have played through critical mode, or even wants to. So naturally, review outlets are warning people that if you're the type of fan who doesn't want to spend all that time grinding away, and you aren't interested in that sort of challenge, the DLC might not be for you because story content is hidden behind it. What exactly is wrong with that? To reference Guitar Hero and Super Meat Boy again, that's like expecting everyone to complete the Dragon Force songs or the Dark World levels to review those respective games. On top of that, I don't see these people complaining about the fact that probably 85% of the reviews from community members I've seen up to this point have admitted to being unable to beat the entire set of bosses yet either. Using this line of logic, none of the people complaining should be able to discuss the quality of the DLC until they beat the game twice more, with both the Pro and Easy menus activated. Trying them out simply isn't enough in their minds after all. Better get that Pro merit level maxed out, and better get all of the Easy merits, otherwise your opinion is invalid, right? Why is there a double standard here? Because IGN and GameSpot are big outlets? Is it not enough that they can try all of the fights other than Yozora? Who said they didn't spend hours on Limit Cut trying all of these battles and getting pretty intimate with them? I held my tongue to some extent when these outlets bowed down to the delicate constitutions and threats of bullying the more vocal fanboys had as the release of KH3 was nearing. A lot of these outlets made videos discussing whether you can even fairly critique something like Kingdom Hearts, because it's so eccentric and special to so many people. This was, of course, nonsense they conjured up to try and soften the attitudes of the elitist sections of the fanbase, to try to somehow convince them of the truth, that these outlets weren't indeed out to ruin their childhoods and mistreat their favorite franchises. Kingdom Hearts isn't special for the love it gets. Plenty of other franchises get that love, and they still deserve fair critique. This sort of shallow, self-absorbed nonsense is exactly why they put that barrier up, because some of the vocal fans of the series refuse to take off their rose-tinted glasses. This childish hostility isn't okay. It's unacceptable. If you want to disagree with their mindset or their conclusion about the DLC, fine, but let's try to be logical, responsible, and respectful about it. Arguing that their opinions are invalid because they can't beat an intentionally brutal boss gauntlet in a DLC they were potentially forced to review on a limited time frame is highly shameful, arrogant, and disrespectful. It honestly feels kind of ableist, because it unintentionally argues that you have to meet a minimum level of capability to have a valid opinion. Okay. My initial experience with the whole of the ReMind DLC was frankly terrible, and honestly, I definitely believe a lot of it is pretty awful, but there's also a lot more good than I expected, which I'm thankful is there. I still wouldn't say it justifies the price tag for me personally, but it got maybe like halfway there. I don't regret my time with the Limit Cut or Secret episodes at all, despite being somewhat disappointed in them still. I liked the new Goat Nord fight, and I liked the pretty set-piece QuickTime events the first time around. I'm also glad I can continue to go back to these difficult fights and play around with them in the future. Since I started writing this script, I've made my way through nearly every fight on Critical. I've done all of them except Xehanort and Yozora at this point. I spent so much time and effort on Yozora the first time that I don't expect he'll be much of a problem. My enjoyment of these fights has increased as I played, though I've also noticed more issues related to the things I've outlined above, kind of leveling things out. Regardless, I still think they're a solid experience. To come full circle on the very beginning of this video, I'd say this does indeed upgrade KH3 from okay to good, if you're willing to spend that much money on the DLC. Even without it, I think the current version of KH3 arguably just hits the threshold to be considered good thanks to the crit update and the 2 new keyblades and all the combo options they added. It's not great by any means, but I'm currently more happy with it than not. Disappointed and frustrated, but happy. Before we wrap up, I'd like to thank Raconius for his involvement in the little skit at the beginning, and mention that the skit itself was just a joke. I wasn't actually planning to blow up on the game, and his taking part in the intro of the video shouldn't actually be taken as an endorsement of the contents of this video. The same goes for everyone else mentioned in this video. These thoughts are mine and mine alone. I'd also like to thank Chrono Katie for allowing me to use the clip from her video on ReMind, and I also want to thank her again for making one of the only ReMind videos I could find from the first few days after release that was actually level-headed and informative. It's worth checking out if you want something much shorter and more conversational than this video is. And with that, we're done with this 2-hour-long video that I figured would top out at like a half an hour. What do you guys think? Did you buy ReMind? If not, why not? And if so, did you enjoy it? What part did you enjoy the most? Where do you disagree with me here? Have your overall feelings on KH3 changed since release? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.